My friend Jessa has this story from her days working at a 24-hour coffee shop in the heart of downtown. It was the kind of place where you'd see all walks of life, especially during her late-night shifts. She had her fair share of weird encounters, but one night still stands out as the peak of her caffeine-fueled chaos career. It was around 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, and things were quiet. Jessa was organizing the pastries when the door burst open, and in walked a guy wearing a full tuxedo, clearly disheveled, with one shoe missing. He looked around like he'd just washed up from a shipwreck and finally locked eyes with Jessa. "You've got to help me," he said, as if his life depended on it. Jessa, startled, asked if he was all right, thinking he might need a phone or directions. Instead, he pointed to a very expensive-looking watch on his wrist and muttered, "I need 300 shots of espresso. Now!" She blinked, wondering if she'd misheard. But he was serious. He waved a black card in front of her and said, "Money's no object. I need this tonight." Trying to keep a straight face, Jessa explained that 300 shots of espresso wasn't just unfeasible, it was dangerous. The guy looked genuinely distressed and started pleading, saying he had a high-stakes poker game happening across the street and he'd made a bet on a dare that he could consume the energy of a god. Jessa couldn't help but laugh at that, but the guy was dead serious, staring at her with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. Finally, she struck a compromise. "How about I make you one of the strongest, largest coffee drinks we can legally make and tell your friends it's 300 shots worth?" He seemed to think about it, then nodded gravely, saying, "Make it look intense." She went all out, pouring enough espresso into a giant ice cup that it looked like a potion, adding whipped cream, chocolate drizzle, and a dash of cinnamon for dramatic effect. When she handed it to him, she made a show of saying, "Here it is, the 100-shot espresso." He looked at it like she'd just handed him the Holy Grail, paid with a ridiculously large tip, and sprinted out, clutching his concoction like it held his fate. About half an hour later, just when Jessa was thinking the night couldn't get any weirder, the guy stumbled back in, looking like he'd just run a marathon. His tux jacket was gone, his shirt was untucked, and he was sweating like crazy. "I won," he panted, "but I lost everything." She wasn't sure if he meant figuratively or literally, and he didn't explain. He just asked if he could sit down for a second. Jessa handed him a glass of water, and he slumped into a booth, mumbling about how he should have known better than to bet with those guys. As he sipped his water, he confided in her that he'd gambled away his watch, his remaining shoe, and his jacket, but had, in fact, won the final round. Jessa listened, half amused, half sympathetic, as he recounted the highs and lows of his caffeine-fueled night. Before he left, he told her, "If anyone ever bets you that you can't drink 300 shots of espresso, just say no. Trust me." And with that, he limped out into the night, one shoe, one sock, and his dignity barely intact. Since that night, Jessa has a story for every customer who asks, "What's the strangest drink you've ever made?" And whenever she sees someone looking at the espresso machine like they're about to order something bold, she'll smile and say, "Just so you know, 300 shots isn't an option." It was a chilly Friday night, and I was wandering through the local art museum, nursing a cheap wine from the complimentary bar at one of those after-hours events. I love these nights. The museum was dimly lit, quieter than usual, and there was something magical about being surrounded by art in the dark. I was studying a massive abstract painting when I heard someone clear their throat beside me. "Okay, maybe it's just me, but does this look like a giant blob of spaghetti to you?" I turned to see a guy around my age, hands in his pockets, giving the painting an exaggeratedly skeptical look. He had one eyebrow raised and a grin that suggested he knew he was being a bit ridiculous. I laughed, raising my glass in agreement. I thought it was a squid caught in a snowstorm, but now that you mention it, I'm seeing spaghetti too. Maybe spaghetti with meatballs? He grinned wider, like we'd just uncovered a hidden joke in the museum. "Spaghetti with meatballs it is. Guess that makes us art critics now." He held out his hand. "I'm Adam, by the way. Amateur art critic, full-time spaghetti enthusiast." "Nice to meet you, Adam." "I'm Claire, part-time art lover, full-time wine enthusiast," I replied, shaking his hand. "Well, Claire, let's critique some more masterpieces," he said, motioning to the next room. "Maybe we'll find a meatball renaissance or a macaroni sculpture collection." I laughed. caught off guard by his easy humor. We wandered through the galleries together, each taking turns creating absurd interpretations of the artwork. He'd make up stories about Greek statues being Jim brothers who got frozen mid-flex, while I reimagined a landscape as a battle between broccoli and Brussels sprouts. The few other people in the room probably thought we were ridiculous, but I didn't care. It felt like we were in our own little world, and I hadn't laughed that much in ages. As we strolled into the Impressionist room, Adam's tone shifted slightly. He looked at a painting of a foggy morning and said quietly, "All right, I can't turn this one into pasta. This is actually beautiful." I glanced at him, surprised by the sudden sincerity. "I know what you mean. It's peaceful, isn't it?" We stood there for a moment, just taking it in. I felt this strange mix of calm and excitement, as if this random encounter was becoming something more than just a funny coincidence. Eventually, we ended up in the museum's small courtyard. The air was cool and crisp, and tiny string lights twinkled above us. He leaned against the railing, looking at me with that same playful grin. "Okay, serious question. Would you rather fight one horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses?" I burst out laughing, shaking my head. 100 duck-sized horses, obviously. They'd be adorable. He groaned in mock disappointment. "See, that's where you're wrong. The horse-sized duck would be over in one good scare. The little ones? They'd swarm you. Trust me, I've thought this through." We debated the topic like it was the most important question of the night, and I could feel this spark between us, something rare and unforced. After a while, we fell quiet, just standing there in the soft light, watching as the night deepened. Finally, he glanced at his watch, looking reluctant. "So, I'm supposed to meet a friend for late-night tacos, but would you want to join? You seem like someone who appreciates a midnight taco." My heart leapt, but I played it cool. "I mean, only if you can promise they won't taste like spaghetti with meatballs." He laughed, holding out his hand. "It's a deal, Claire. Midnight tacos, no spaghetti in sight." As we walked out of the museum together, it felt like I'd stepped into a story, one where a simple night at the museum turned into an unexpected adventure. And as we strolled down the street, I realized I'd found my favorite work of art that night, hidden in the easy laughter and spontaneous connection with a stranger who felt like someone I'd known forever. Senior year, during our last week before graduation, we decided it was time to pull off the prank to end all pranks. Every class had tried to outdo the last, and we were determined to be remembered. So, after days of brainstorming, someone, probably Trevor, who had way too much confidence and no sense of self-preservation, proposed we turn the entire school into a haunted house overnight. The plan was ridiculous and required military-level coordination, but we were committed. First, we spent weeks gathering supplies: glow-in-the-dark paint, fake cobwebs, sound effects, and plastic skeletons. Trevor's cousin worked at a costume shop and hooked us up with enough props to make the place look like Dracula's mansion. We mapped out the hallways, assigning different areas to small teams so no spot was left untouched. The night before, around 2 a.m., about 20 of us snuck in through the unlocked gym door, thanks to one friend on the basketball team who forgot to lock it. We split up and got to work, covering every hallway with eerie decorations. We rigged motion-activated speakers to play creepy sounds, covered the lockers in cobwebs, and hung skeletons from the ceiling. A couple of us even went a little overboard, using toilet paper to mummify the principal's door. We were fast and efficient, but by 4:30 a.m., we were exhausted, laughing so hard we could barely stand. The next morning, the scene was perfect chaos. Teachers walked in first, and we watched through the windows as they stopped in their tracks, trying to process what they were seeing. Mrs. Daniels, the strict English teacher, actually gasped when a fake bat dropped from the ceiling right in front of her. By the time students arrived, word had spread, and everyone came through the doors wide-eyed, taking in the spooky maze we created. Phones were out everywhere, snapping pictures and videos, and everyone kept asking, "Who did this?" But the best reaction was Principal Carter's. He walked in, took one long look around, sighed deeply, and muttered, "Every year with these kids." Then he made his way to the intercom and announced, "Good morning to whoever thought they'd turn my school into a haunted house. Report to my office." Immediately, We all thought we were toast. But when we got to his office, Principal Carter just shook his head, obviously trying not to laugh. "I should give you all detention," he said, "but frankly, I'm impressed." He paused, looked at each of us, and added, "But you're cleaning it all up after school. Every cobweb." We couldn't believe it. We'd actually gotten away with it. As a final touch, we put one last skeleton on top of the school's entry sign, dressed in a cap and gown with a banner that read, "Class of 2023, here to haunt you forever." It stayed up for days, a weird little memorial to our prank. The cleanup was brutal, but honestly, worth every second. And years later, whenever I drive by, I can still picture that skeleton grinning down from the sign, as if it knew we'd pulled off the perfect senior send-off. I had almost talked myself out of it. The plan was a dinner party, small, just a handful of people. And while I love my friends, I wasn't sure I had the energy to be social that night. But after a particularly convincing text from my friend Jenna, "Come on, it'll be fun," I found myself agreeing to join, grabbing a bottle of wine and telling myself that I'd leave early. The apartment was already filled with laughter and the smell of food when I arrived. Jenna greeted me with a grin and pulled me into the kitchen, shoving a glass of wine into my hand. People were chatting in small groups, the kind of comfortable, easygoing vibe that always feels like home. I relaxed a little, even caught myself laughing as I joined the conversation, the stress of the week slowly melting away. And then he walked in, tall, with a disheveled charm that was both unassuming and magnetic. He had a presence that drew everyone's attention without him even trying. Our eyes met across the room, and he gave me a small, curious smile, one that felt like he was already in on some inside joke we hadn't shared yet. I felt my stomach do a little flip, the kind that comes from an unexpected jolt of excitement. It didn't take long before he made his way over, introducing himself as Nate. His voice was low, warm, and he had a way of making even the most casual words sound meaningful. We slipped into conversation, and from the first few minutes, I could tell he was different, thoughtful, attentive, with a dry sense of humor that kept me on my toes. There was an instant ease between us, like we'd somehow skipped the awkward introductions and were already at that comfortable place most people only reach after months of knowing each other. As the night went on, we found ourselves drifting away from the rest of the group, talking by the window while the city lights sparkled outside. He told me about his work as a photographer, the way he saw the world through his lens, capturing moments that most people miss. He had a passion that was rare, genuine, and I found myself completely captivated by the way he spoke, like he could see the world in colors and details that most people overlooked. I shared things with him too, pieces of myself that I rarely talked about, my own dreams and fears, things I didn't usually reveal. There was something in his gaze that made me feel safe, understood, like he wasn't just listening, but truly seeing me. Hours slipped by unnoticed, and it wasn't until Jenna walked by, giving us a knowing look, that I realized how absorbed I'd become in our conversation. At some point, he suggested we go for a walk, and without a second thought, I agreed. We left the warm, bustling apartment behind and stepped into the cool night air, the streets quiet and bathed in the glow of streetlights. We wandered through empty sidewalks, our footsteps the only sound, as we shared stories and secrets, the kind of things you can only share in those rare, magical moments when two people feel perfectly in sync. Eventually, we found ourselves at a small park, sitting on a bench under the stars. There was a pause, a comfortable silence, and then he turned to me, his eyes soft and searching. I wasn't sure who leaned in first, but our lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and intense, a question and an answer all at once. It was as if the world had paused just for us, leaving only the quiet night and the warmth between us. We stayed like that for a while, talking in whispers, sharing little pieces of ourselves as the night deepened around us. It felt surreal, like a dream I hadn't quite woken up from, and I found myself wishing that this moment could stretch on forever. Eventually, he walked me home, his hand warm around mine as we strolled through the empty streets. When we reached my door, there was a lingering silence, both of us reluctant to end the night. He looked at me with a soft smile, like he understood the bittersweetness of the moment, and I felt my heart ache just a little, knowing that nights like these don't come around often. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, and I felt the weight of his words, the way they carried something unspoken yet understood. As I slipped inside, I felt a strange mix of happiness and sadness, a quiet sense of longing already settling in. The night had been perfect, magical in a way that felt both real and impossible, and I knew it was a memory I'd carry with me for a long time. The next morning, as the sunlight streamed through my window, I replayed every moment in my mind. The laughter, the closeness, the way he'd looked at me like he'd seen something worth holding on to. I felt a pang, knowing that as beautiful as the night had been, it was already becoming a memory, something fleeting and precious that I couldn't quite keep. In the days that followed, I kept thinking back to that night with Nate, the warmth of his gaze, the feeling of being truly seen. It was a reminder of what it feels like to connect, to share a piece of yourself with someone who wants to understand. I realized that, as much as I loved the spontaneity of it, I was craving something more than just a perfect night. I wanted a connection that could last, that wouldn't fade with the dawn. That night left me with a quiet hope, a sense of possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could find something that felt as real in the daylight as it did in the magic of the night. Until then, I'll hold on to that memory, a little piece of wonder that reminds me of what's possible, and the kind of connection I'm still searching for. I wasn't entirely sure what I was getting into when I took the job as a night shift pet sitter for an upscale boarding facility. It sounded simple enough on paper. Watch over the pets, feed them, make sure they're comfortable. But this wasn't your typical pet kennel. This place was luxurious, with private suites for each pet, personalized meal plans, a sprawling indoor dog park, and even a spa area. My job was to tend to the nighttime routine for our high-maintenance furry clientele. On my first night, I met my supervisor, Janine, a no-nonsense woman who gave me a quick tour before she headed out, leaving me alone with the four-legged VIPs. She handed me a list of the pets and their needs, along with a warning. The owners expect top-tier treatment. Whatever these animals want, you make it happen. She raised an eyebrow like she was testing me, then walked out the door, leaving me with about 30 pets who all seemed to be watching me with varying degrees of suspicion. The first couple of hours were quiet. Most of the dogs were already curled up in their suites, snoozing on their plush beds, and the cats lounged in their condos, eyeing me with disdain from atop their climbing towers. Just as I started thinking it might actually be an easy shift, I noticed a faint scratching sound coming from one of the suites. I walked over and found my first problem child of the night, a tiny Yorkie named Princess Pippa. She was scratching at the glass door, staring up at me with the kind of intensity usually reserved for interrogations. I opened her door, and she immediately trotted out, looking at me expectantly. I remembered her owner's instructions on the clipboard. Pippa needs a bedtime story read aloud to settle down. I blinked at the paper, convinced it was a joke. But Princess Pippa was waiting, tapping her tiny paw impatiently. Resigned, I found a book in the reading nook. Yes, they had a pet-friendly reading nook, and sat down, flipping open Goodnight Moon. As I read, she relaxed, curling up by my feet with a sigh, and by the time I was halfway through, she was snoring. I quietly backed away, wondering if I'd ever live down reading bedtime stories to a dog. I was just starting to get into the rhythm of things when I heard a deep, mournful howl echo down the hallway. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. I followed the noise to the suite of Maximus, a massive Great Dane who looked like he belonged in a medieval castle rather than a posh pet hotel. His owner had left instructions that he needed constant companionship, or he'd get anxious. I slipped into his suite, and he immediately leaned his giant head on my shoulder, his tail wagging as if I'd saved him from a lifetime of solitude. So there I sat, awkwardly patting his head, whispering reassurances until he finally flopped onto his side and fell asleep. One paw draped over my foot like he couldn't bear the thought of me leaving. By now, it was almost midnight, and I thought maybe I could sit down and take a break. But then I remembered Queenie, the Persian cat who had a strict grooming schedule. According to her file, she expected a nightly brush before bed, or she'd throw a fit. I opened her suite door, and there she was, her golden eyes practically glowing in the dark, staring me down like a judge assessing my worthiness. I found her brush and began stroking her luxurious fur, trying not to breathe too loudly in case it offended Her Royal Highness. Queenie purred, stretching out lazily, and for a brief moment, I thought we'd come to an understanding, until she batted at my hand with her claws out, as if to say, "Enough." Message received. Around 2 a.m., just as I was starting to feel like I might survive the night, I noticed that one of the deluxe suites was empty. Panic surged through me. I scanned the list, and my stomach dropped. Mr. Tinkles, the escape artist Pomeranian, had somehow managed to Houdini himself out of his suite. I spent the next half hour crawling around the facility, calling his name in a frantic whisper, my heart racing. Finally, I found him wedged under a couch in the playroom, his tiny face peeking out, looking utterly pleased with himself. I coaxed him out with a treat and carried him back to his suite, where he promptly curled up, content. I wasn't sure if I wanted to laugh or cry. As the sun started to rise, I sat down, exhausted but oddly satisfied. Each of those pets had their own quirks, their little routines, and somehow, I'd managed to keep them all happy, from the bedtime story diva to the Great Dane with separation anxiety. When Janine came in for the morning shift, she looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "Survived, did you?" she asked with a knowing smile. I just nodded, too tired to explain the epic saga of the night. Walking out, I realized that this job was far stranger and more demanding than anything I'd expected. But it was also oddly rewarding. Each pet, with their eccentric needs and hilarious personalities, had left me feeling like I'd been part of some surreal, four-legged soap opera. As I headed home, I knew I'd be back the next night, ready for whatever ridiculous demands awaited me. After all, who else would read Goodnight Moon to a Yorkie named Princess Pippa? We'd been best friends since freshman year of high school. He was that friend I could call in the middle of the night, who I could goof off with for hours, who somehow knew every corner of my mind. People always asked if we'd ever be more, and we'd laugh, swearing that we'd never even thought about it. He's like my brother, I'd say, with absolute confidence. And I believed it. He was the one person I could count on to be solid, to be safe. Love stories were messy, and what we had was perfect, or so I thought. Then came a night that changed everything. It was our high school reunion, and a group of us had decided to go out afterward. By the end of the night, it was just the two of us, laughing over drinks in a bar we'd snuck into once when we were 18. We'd been reminiscing all evening, caught up in a whirlwind of memories, laughing about every cringe-worthy moment we'd survived. But as the night wore on, the laughter faded, and suddenly, it was just the two of us, sitting across from each other, looking at each other in a way we never had before. "Ever think about what it would have been like if we'd tried, being more than friends?" he asked, his voice soft. I laughed, assuming he was kidding, but when I looked up, I saw that he was serious, his eyes studying me as if he was seeing me for the first time. My heart skipped, a feeling I couldn't place washing over me. I'd spent years laughing off the idea, but in that moment, with his eyes holding mine, I felt something shift. We walked home in silence, the weight of that question hanging between us. When we got to my place, he lingered at the door, and without thinking, I leaned in and hugged him, tighter than usual. He hugged me back, his hands lingering on my back, and before I knew what I was doing, I tilted my face up to his. It was like something took over, something bigger than both of us. And then he kissed me, and every assumption I'd ever had shattered in an instant. It was the kind of kiss that felt inevitable, like it had been waiting for years to happen. The next morning, I woke up in his arms, and everything felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into an alternate universe. We lay there, tangled in each other, laughing about how we'd been blind for so long. But as the laughter faded, reality set in. We both realized almost at the same time what a risk we were taking, how close we were to losing something we'd spent our entire lives building. We spent the next few weeks in this strange limbo. We'd meet up for coffee, pretending everything was the same, only to end up talking late into the night, both of us afraid to label what was happening. My heart felt like it was on a roller coaster. The thrill of finally letting myself feel something more mixed with the terror of what it might mean. Every time I was with him, it felt right, but every time I was alone, doubt crept in, whispering that maybe we were making a huge mistake. One night, after hours of silence, he finally called me. "Can we just talk? I can't stand this," he said, his voice tense. We met up at the park, and he looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying the same weight I had. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair, and said, "I don't know where this is going, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't pretend that you're just my friend." Hearing him say it out loud made it all real, like a door I'd been too scared to open was finally swinging wide. I felt every fear melt away, and before I knew it, I was in his arms again, both of us letting go of years of unspoken feelings. We sat there under the stars, talking for hours about all the what-ifs we'd never dared to voice. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing, like we'd finally found something we'd both been searching for without even knowing. We decided to take things slow, both of us cautious, but both of us too excited to hold back. Our friendship transformed, turning into something richer, something more profound. But there were still moments of doubt, times when I'd wonder if this was real, if he felt as deeply as I did, if we could survive the risk we were taking. There were days when he'd look at me, and I'd see the same questions in his eyes. But each time, we came back to each other, reminded of all the years that had brought us here. I'd never known love could feel like this, like coming home, like finally finding a missing piece of myself. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations. It was just us, discovering something beautiful we'd been holding all along. Today, he's still my best friend, but he's also the person I want beside me through every high and low, the one I want to build a future with. It's not a fairy tale. It's better than that because it's real, because it's ours. And sometimes when I catch him looking at me with that familiar smile, I feel like the luckiest person in the world. Because I've found something that's worth every risk, every question, every moment of doubt. We often laugh about how it took us so long to get here, but maybe that was the point. Maybe we had to grow into this, to go through our own journeys before we could finally see what had been right in front of us. And now I wouldn't trade a second of it. He's my best friend, my love, my partner in every adventure. And I finally understand that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones you never seek. It was the kind of Saturday night where nothing was planned, but somehow you end up having the best time. My best friend, Leo, and I had made a last-minute decision to go to his mom's place. She lived just outside the city and had this big, cozy house with a view of the hills. Leo's mom, Danny, was more than just a mom to us. She was the life of the party, always in the middle of every laugh, keeping up with us on everything from music to dating, like she was our age. That night, we all sat around her kitchen table, catching up and drinking like old friends. Eventually, Leo headed to bed, leaving just me and Danny. She poured us another round of whiskey, giving me that sly grin she always had, and started talking about how different life felt now that Leo was an adult, how she'd spent so much time raising him that she'd forgotten to think about herself. There was a vulnerability to her I hadn't seen before, and I listened, feeling like I was getting a glimpse of Danny as a real person, not just Leo's mom. After a while, we moved out to the patio, watching the stars, both of us a little buzzed, laughing at things that probably weren't that funny. At some point, there was this long silence between us, one of those pauses where you can feel something shifting but don't quite know what. She looked over at me, her expression unreadable, and before I knew it, we were leaning in, crossing that line I'd never even thought of before. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. Danny was already up, sipping her coffee at the kitchen table, giving me this half-smile that made it all feel even more surreal. I was ready to apologize, to say it was just a stupid, drunken lapse in judgment, but she shook her head slightly, as if to say, "It's okay." I thought that was the end of it, just a weird, one-time thing, and left that morning without a word. But a few days later, she texted me, asking if I wanted to grab lunch. I ignored it at first, but the curiosity, and admittedly, the thrill, got the better of me, and soon enough, I found myself meeting her at a quiet cafe where no one would know us. Lunch turned into dinner, dinner into late nights back at her place whenever Leo wasn't around. I was in way over my head, but I couldn't stop myself. Danny was magnetic in a way I hadn't expected, and each time we met, the secrecy only made it feel more intense. Then the inevitable happened. Leo found out. I still don't know exactly how. Maybe he caught a look between us or saw a text on my phone. All I know is that one night, as we were all sitting around a table at a bar, Leo looked at me, his face pale, and asked, "Are you sleeping with my mom?" The words hit like a gut punch. The whole place went silent, and I could feel the weight of every lie I'd told him pressing down on me. I tried to deny it, stammer something, anything, but the truth was already out. He stormed out, leaving me there, knowing I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. Danny texted me trying to explain, saying she'd talked to Leo, but I knew it was pointless. I had betrayed my best friend, broken a trust that had taken years to build. After that night, Leo cut me off completely, and Danny and I stopped whatever we had going. Months passed, and whenever I think of that night, I feel the loss of a friendship that I ruined in a moment of recklessness, all for something that never should have happened. It was a Thursday night, and I was on my way home from work, exhausted and ready to collapse in a bed. But as I passed by my favorite cafe, I noticed the dim lights and the soft glow spilling out into the street. I don't know why I went in. I just felt drawn to it, like I needed a change of pace, a little escape from the monotony of my day. I ordered a coffee, found a small table by the window, and settled in, content to watch the city move by outside. Then he walked in. He looked a bit out of place in his worn leather jacket, his hair slightly disheveled, like he'd been caught in the rain and hadn't bothered to fix it. He scanned the room, spotted an empty seat by the window next to mine, and asked if he could join me. I nodded, surprised at myself for agreeing so quickly. He introduced himself as Leo, his voice calm and warm, and he had this quiet confidence, a gentleness that felt rare. We started talking, and before I knew it, our conversation flowed easily from one topic to another, weaving through lighthearted jokes and deeper thoughts. There was something about him that put me completely at ease, like I'd known him for years instead of minutes. The cafe was emptying out around us, but neither of us made a move to leave. We talked about our jobs, our favorite places in the city, the strange coincidences that had shaped our lives. It was effortless, the kind of conversation that felt like an escape from everything else. The longer we talked, the more I felt this strange pull, a feeling I couldn't quite put into words. He had a way of listening that made me feel like the only person in the room, like every word I said mattered. Eventually, he glanced at his watch, and I felt a pang of disappointment, thinking the night was coming to an end. But then he gave me a smile, warm and a little mischievous, and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said yes without thinking, my heart beating a little faster, and together we stepped out into the quiet, chilly night. We walked through empty streets, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The world felt still, like we'd slipped into some hidden part of the city that was just for us. We stopped to look at shop windows, made up stories about the lives of strangers, and shared secrets that felt both thrilling and safe. He told me about his passion for music, how he was trying to build a career as a musician, even though it felt impossible most days. I could hear the quiet determination in his voice, and it made me admire him in a way I hadn't expected. As we walked, he reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine with a warmth that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a promise, like he was inviting me into something I couldn't quite define. The night took on a soft glow, the city lights blurring around us as we kept walking, neither of us wanting to break the spell. Eventually, we found ourselves at a small, empty park, sitting side by side on a bench, both lost in the quiet of the night. We didn't speak for a while, just shared the silence, our hands still entwined, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. When he turned to me, his eyes soft and searching, I knew what was coming, but it still took my breath away when he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both tender and full of unspoken words. The rest of the night passed in a blur of closeness, laughter, and moments of quiet that felt just as meaningful as the conversation. We sat there for hours, talking, sharing pieces of ourselves we didn't usually reveal, like we were both giving each other little fragments of our lives that no one else had. It felt like we'd created our own little world, one that existed only in the shadows and quiet of that night. By the time we left the park, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, casting everything in a pale, gentle glow. He walked me back to my building, our steps slow, both of us reluctant to say goodbye. When we reached my door, he looked at me with a soft smile, and I knew he was feeling the same bittersweet ache that I was. We didn't say much, just held each other for a moment, letting the night linger a little longer. As I slipped inside, I felt a mix of happiness and sadness, a quiet longing that settled over me like a whisper. I knew that this night, this connection, was something rare, something that would stay with me long after the memory started to fade. I lay in bed that morning, watching the sunlight fill my room, replaying every moment, every word, and feeling the warmth of his hand still wrapped around mine. The days that followed felt strange, like I was walking through a dream, holding onto a memory that felt both real and unreal. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he'd looked at me, the feeling of being truly seen. It was a reminder of what it feels like to connect, to let someone in, even if only for a night. And while part of me wished I could see him again, another part understood that maybe that night was meant to stand alone, perfect and untouched. That night with Leo showed me what I'd been missing, the thrill of connection, the beauty of sharing a part of yourself with someone who understands. It reminded me that while fleeting moments are beautiful, they don't always need to turn into something lasting. Sometimes, they're just there to show you a glimpse of what's possible, to leave you with a quiet hope. So now, I hold that night close, a little piece of magic I carry with me, a reminder of the kind of connection I'm still searching for. Until I find it, I'll keep that memory safe, a spark of warmth on quiet nights, a reminder that somewhere out there, moments like that are still waiting. I met Eric at a mutual friend's game night, where he instantly charmed the whole room with his quick wit and goofy charisma. He had this boyish grin and an easy laugh that made him instantly likable, the kind of guy who'd make a dad joke just to get people to roll their eyes. By the end of the night, we were bantering like we'd known each other forever, and when he suggested we go out for dinner sometime, I found myself genuinely excited. We agreed to meet at a cozy Mexican restaurant, and I arrived to find him already seated, grinning from ear to ear. He greeted me with a big hug, and the night kicked off with margaritas and nachos, both of us talking and laughing so much that I barely noticed the time passing. It felt refreshingly easy, until somewhere around the main course when things took an unexpected left turn. "So, do you have any pets?" I asked, figuring it was an innocuous question. He gave a sly smile and replied, "Sort of." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Sort of?" I asked. He leaned in, glancing around as if we were sharing a huge secret. "Well, I keep spiders," he said, completely serious. "Tarantulas, actually." I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but he didn't laugh back. He nodded with the kind of enthusiasm that only someone truly in love with spiders could have. "They're incredible creatures. I have 6 right now. Each one has a unique personality." He pulled out his phone, scrolling to show me pictures. Sure enough, there were close-ups of these hairy, massive tarantulas. Each one posed like they were in a fashion shoot, with captions like, "Fluffy just got a new tank," and "Here's her legs a lot hanging out on my shoulder." I tried to keep my expression neutral, but he must have noticed my hesitation because he chuckled and said, "People usually have that reaction. But trust me, they're amazing. Once you get over the whole giant spider thing, they're actually really affectionate." Affectionate. That was the word he used. "Do you handle them?" I asked, a little horrified, but too curious to stop myself. He nodded, completely unfazed. "Oh yeah, they're very gentle once they trust you. I let them crawl on me all the time." He went on to explain how he'd spent years researching tarantula behavior, and that he even made little enrichment activities for them to keep them stimulated. I was on the verge of laughing, thinking, is this guy for real? But his face was dead serious. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, asking about his family, but he seemed determined to keep it firmly in the realm of arachnids. He went on about how misunderstood spiders were, how they had healing energy, and how people would be spiritually transformed if they just spent some time with them. Then he leaned forward and, in a conspiratorial whisper, said, "I actually believe they're my spirit guides." I sat there, my brain struggling to process this new information. "You mean spiders?" I managed to ask. He nodded, his face completely sincere. "Yes, they're ancient, wise creatures. I feel like they're here to teach me something. You know? Patience, self-acceptance, things like that." He paused, looking at me intently. "They've helped me become who I am. I honestly don't know if I'd be the same person without them." At this point, I was both fascinated and mildly horrified, wondering if he was going to pull a tarantula out of his pocket next. But I forced a smile, nodding along as he went on about his journey of self-discovery through spiders. Just as I thought he might finally be finished, he took a deep breath and looked at me with a gleam in his eye. "Would you like to meet them?" he asked, as if he'd just invited me to meet his family. Before I could respond, he leaned in, lowering his voice. "Not everyone gets the invitation," he said with a wink. "But I feel a strong connection with you, and I think you'd love them. I could introduce you to Cleopatra, my Mexican red knee. She's the gentlest." I sat there, frozen, torn between running for the exit and seeing this strange scenario all the way through. I managed a weak smile and mumbled something about how I wasn't sure I was spiritually prepared for spiders. He nodded, completely understanding, and assured me that no one's ever ready for Cleopatra. Somehow, the check arrived just in time, and I breathed a sigh of relief. As we left the restaurant, he walked me to my car, casually mentioning that he was planning to expand his spider family. "I'm thinking of adopting a Brazilian salmon pink bird eater," he said, as if he were talking about getting a puppy. "They're one of the largest tarantula species in the world." I forced a polite smile, making vague sounds of encouragement as I inched toward my car door. He gave me a warm hug, saying this was really special. "I feel like the spiders guided us together tonight." I smiled, thanked him for dinner, and slid into my car, trying to keep it together until I'd driven away. The second I got home, I was flooded with texts from him. "Hope you got home safe. Spider, I had such a great time. Let me know if you're up for meeting Cleopatra sometime." He followed up with a string of spider emojis and a photo of him holding his tarantula, giving me a thumbs up. Needless to say, I didn't reply. I spent the next few days dodging his messages, which continued to come in like clockwork. Eventually, he sent a final, slightly mournful message. I guess the connection wasn't as strong as I thought. "Best wishes on your journey." He added one last spider emoji as a farewell. From then on, my friends dubbed him Spider Guy, and any mention of him would immediately have everyone in hysterics. To this day, I can't walk past a pet store without wondering how many unsuspecting people have gotten the Cleopatra invitation. While I have nothing against a person's love for their pets, I decided to stick with the non-eight-legged variety from here on. I swear I never meant to start a career out of knitting. If you had asked me a few years ago what I'd be doing with my life, I probably would have said something vague about climbing the corporate ladder, maybe moving to a bigger city or learning another language. I definitely wouldn't have said I'd be sitting in a cozy studio surrounded by shells of yarn, making a living out of creating ridiculous, oversized scarves. But that's exactly what happened, and it all started with a pair of knitting needles my grandmother left me. I was never particularly close with my grandma, Nana Joe, but I knew she loved knitting. She knit blankets, mittens, scarves, and sweaters for everyone in the family. Growing up, there was always some knitted item in our house that had her touch, something cozy with her unique blend of clashing colors and quirky patterns. When she passed, I found myself with one of her last projects, a half-finished, chunky green scarf with a big set of wooden knitting needles still in it. I had no clue what to do with it, but I couldn't bear to throw it away. So, one rainy weekend, I sat down, watched a few knitting tutorials online, and decided to give finishing that scarf a shot. The first few hours were an absolute disaster. My stitches were too tight or too loose, and at one point, I somehow managed to turn the scarf into a lopsided triangle. But after hours of knitting and unraveling, something started to click. By the time I finished, the scarf was far from perfect, but it was mine, and it felt like a piece of Nana Joe, something I could keep forever. From that moment, I was hooked. I started knitting every evening after work, making scarves, beanies, mittens, you name it. There was something meditative about it, the repetitive motion, the focus it took to get each stitch just right. It became my way to unwind, a calm that I hadn't realized I needed. Soon, my apartment was filled with little knitting projects in various stages, and I had more scarves than I knew what to do with. That winter, I gifted some of my creations to friends and family, just for fun. My friends loved them, which was surprising because I thought they were a little too out there. I had a habit of using the brightest yarn I could find, electric blues, neon pinks, rich purples. My friends started wearing my scarves out and posting photos on social media, tagging me in them with captions like, "Thanks to the Queen of Cozy for my new fave scarf. And if you want to survive winter, you need one of these." Then one night, as a total joke, my friend Maya posted a picture of herself wrapped up in one of my ridiculously oversized scarves with the hashtag #ChunkyQueen. The post got way more attention than either of us expected, with people commenting things like, "OMG, where did you get that scarf?" and "I need one of these in my life." Within a few days, random strangers were messaging me, asking if I sold my scarves or could make them one. At first, I laughed it off. Sell my knitting? I'd never even thought about it. But then Maya sent me a text that changed everything. "You know, you could actually make a business out of this, right?" The idea was wild, but it stuck in my mind. The thought of starting a side hustle sounded both fun and terrifying, but the response on social media had me wondering if I was onto something. I set up a simple Etsy shop called Chunky Queen Knits and listed a few of my scarves with funny names like the Cozy Monster and the Arctic Hug. I priced them modestly, not really expecting to sell any. I just wanted to see if anyone would even be interested. To my shock, all my scarves sold out within a week. I scrambled to make more, listing new colors and designs, and once again, they were gone almost immediately. People were leaving rave reviews, sharing how much they loved their scarves and how warm and fun they felt wearing them. There was even a trend among some customers who'd send me chunky selfies, wrapped up in my scarves, which I reposted on Instagram. The hashtag #ChunkyQueen had started gaining traction, and people began tagging their friends or asking if I made custom orders. Before I knew it, I was spending every evening and weekend knitting like a madwoman to keep up with the demand. By midwinter, my Etsy shop was booming, and I was getting messages from local boutiques asking if I'd be interested in selling my scarves in their stores. I was working a full-time job in marketing, juggling deadlines and client meetings, but my true focus was on my growing side business. It wasn't long before I was making nearly as much from my knitting as I was from my job. Then, one day, I got an email from an editor at a popular fashion magazine. She'd seen my scarves on Instagram and wanted to feature one of my designs in an article about winter trends. I couldn't believe it. The Chunky Queen scarves were supposed to be a quirky little side project, not something that made it into a fashion magazine. But sure enough, a month later, there it was, a whole spread featuring my Cozy Monster scarf with a little blurb about the cozy statement piece of the season. After that, things exploded. Orders poured in faster than I could make scarves, and I had to hire a few other local knitters just to keep up with demand. I found a small studio space downtown, set it up with cozy chairs, shelves of yarn, and plenty of coffee mugs, and started knitting full-time. It felt surreal to walk into that studio every morning, surrounded by baskets of yarn, knowing that my workday would be spent doing something I loved. With the business growing, I started expanding my designs, adding chunky blankets, cozy hats, and even knitted huggable pillows to the line. I experimented with different yarn textures, colors, and patterns, creating pieces that were as fun as they were functional. I even started a blog where I shared knitting tips and DIY tutorials, and to my surprise, it gained a small but loyal following of people who wanted to learn from the Chunky Queen herself. Now, every winter, Chunky Queen Knits has a wait list that starts months in advance. I've shipped my scarves all over the world, from cozy cabins in Canada to trendy boutiques in Tokyo. I've had people send me photos of my scarves in every setting imaginable, wrapped around hikers on snowy mountain trails, keeping warm on early morning commutes, and even as wedding gifts for couples who wanted a hug they could wear. Sometimes I think about how close I was to leaving those knitting needles untouched, and I can't believe how that one small choice, finishing my grandmother's scarf, led to this. My little business turned out to be a way to honor Nana Joe's memory, and to pass on a bit of that warmth and comfort she gave to all of us through her creations. So here I am, the Chunky Queen, turning big, bright balls of yarn into cozy works of art. My studio is a lively, laughter-filled place where people come to knit, chat, and escape from the world for a bit, just like I did when I first started. I have regulars who come to every new workshop I host, and I even offer knit nights where we gather, drink tea, and share our latest projects. Who knew that a pair of knitting needles and a pile of yarn could be the key to my happiness? Every time I pick up those needles, I feel this strange, beautiful connection to my past, to my grandmother, and to everyone out there who just wants a little extra warmth in their life. And every stitch feels like a little reminder that the best things in life often start as small, unexpected passions. The night I got the message from Claire, I almost ignored it. I was halfway through an episode of some show I couldn't remember the name of, the hum of city lights drifting through my window, when my phone buzzed. It was from her, my first love, the girl who taught me how to drive and made me laugh when I thought nothing in the world could. But we hadn't spoken in years. "Hey, I know it's been a while, but I'd love to see you. I'm in town. Can we meet?" I stared at the message, a knot tightening in my chest. So much time had passed since we'd last seen each other. We'd parted on good terms, promising to stay friends, but life had a way of taking us down different roads. She'd moved to a new city, chasing dreams I barely understood, while I stayed here, finding comfort in the familiar. Still, there was something about her message that felt urgent, like it carried an unspoken weight. Before I knew it, I typed back, "Sure. When and where?" She suggested a small cafe tucked away on the edge of town, a place we used to go when we were too broke for anything but coffee and shared dessert. I hadn't been there in years, but the memories flooded back as soon as I stepped inside. The place looked exactly the same, warm, dimly lit, with mismatched chairs and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. And there she was, sitting by the window, her hair tucked behind her ear, a faint smile playing on her lips as she stared out at the street. She looked different, older, but there was still that spark in her eyes, that hint of mischief that had always drawn me in. "Claire," I said softly, and she turned, her face lighting up as she saw me. "Hey," she replied, standing up to hug me. Her arms wrapped around me, warm and familiar, and for a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. We sat down, the small table between us, and ordered coffee. There was a moment of quiet as we both took each other in, the weight of the years stretching between us. She looked good, happier, maybe more settled. And yet, there was something in her expression, a sadness she couldn't quite hide. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "what brings you back to town?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I just needed to see you. There's been a lot on my mind lately. Things I never got to say." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of something I hadn't felt in a long time, a mix of nostalgia, longing, maybe even regret. "I didn't think I'd hear from you again," I admitted, my voice soft. She looked up, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "I know. I thought maybe I'd moved on, that I didn't need closure. But it's funny, isn't it? How some things stay with you, even when you think they won't." We talked for hours, slipping back into the easy rhythm we'd once shared, each story another thread weaving us back together. She told me about her life in the city, her job, her friends, the new places she'd found. And I told her about my life here, the steady pace of familiar days, the way I'd found peace in the things that once felt too small. At one point, she looked at me, her gaze intense. "Do you ever think about what we had?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my throat tighten. "Sometimes," I admitted, "I wonder what might have happened if we'd stayed together, if we'd tried harder." She nodded, her eyes drifting down to her hands. "I've thought about it too, but I think we were both scared. Scared of holding each other back, of losing ourselves." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "Maybe we were, but that doesn't mean it didn't matter. You mattered to me, Claire, more than I think you'll ever know." She squeezed my hand, her eyes shining. "And you matter to me too, more than I let myself believe." We sat like that, hand in hand, letting the silence fill the space between us. The cafe was nearly empty by then, the lights dimming as closing time approached. But neither of us made a move to leave. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. I came back because, well, I needed to say goodbye. To really say it. I'm moving again. This time it's for good. The words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Where are you going? A small town in Maine, she replied, smiling softly. I got a job offer I couldn't turn down. It's a fresh start, somewhere quiet. I nodded, my heart aching in a way that felt both familiar and new. That sounds perfect for you. She smiled, a bittersweet expression that made my chest tighten. Maybe it is, but I needed to see you one last time. I needed to know that we were okay. We're okay, Claire, I said, my voice breaking just a little. We always were. We left the cafe together, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were quiet, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. We walked in silence, side by side, until we reached the park where we'd spent so many nights talking, dreaming, making promises we hadn't been able to keep. We stopped by the swings, and she turned to me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, my hand lingering for just a moment. Thank you, I replied, for teaching me what love was, and what it could be. She smiled, a small, fragile smile, and then, slowly, she leaned in, her lips brushing mine in a soft, gentle kiss. It was like coming home, like finding something I hadn't realized I'd lost. But there was a finality to it, a quiet acceptance that this was our goodbye. When she pulled back, her eyes were glistening, and I felt my own tears threatening to spill over. She reached up, cupping my face, her thumb brushing my cheek. Take care of yourself? Okay. I will. I promised, my voice thick. You too. She gave me one last smile, and then, with a lingering glance, she turned and walked away, her figure fading into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, the night air cool against my skin, watching as she disappeared into the distance. And as I stood there, I felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me. Maybe we hadn't gotten our happy ending, but we'd had something real, something that had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I walked home slowly, letting the memories wash over me, each step a reminder of everything we'd shared, everything we'd lost, and everything we'd found along the way. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. If you'd told me that quitting my corporate job would lead to a career involving rubber ducks, I would have laughed you out of the room. And yet, here I am, running an entire business centered on these little yellow plastic birds, all because of one impulsive joke. It started at my friend Sarah's baby shower. I'd volunteered to help with the decorations, and in my eagerness to make the party extra memorable, I decided to go with a rubber duck theme. It was cute, gender-neutral, and honestly just funny to me. So I went all out, duck-shaped balloons, duck-themed snacks, and of course, a dozen rubber ducks floating around in a big bowl of punch. The ducks were an instant hit. People loved them, snapping photos and holding the little ducks up for selfies. Sarah's aunt even asked if she could take a few home for the grandkids. At the end of the party, I still had a few ducks left, so I tossed them in my bag without a second thought. The following Monday, back at the office, I spotted one of those ducks at the bottom of my work tote. For reasons I still can't explain, I decided to put it on my desk. It was just meant to be a little joke to make my boring workspace a bit more cheerful. But as soon as my coworkers saw it, they started laughing. Within a few days, someone added a sticky note under it that said, "Duck of the Month." Another coworker brought in a mini crown to put on the duck, dubbing it King Duck. Before I knew it, Desk Duck became a small office mascot. One morning, I arrived at my desk to find a second duck placed next to the original, with a small sign that read, "Duck Buddies." Over the next few weeks, more ducks appeared on desks all over the office, each with its own quirky accessory. People were getting way too into it, dressing up their ducks, decorating their desks to match. It was hilarious and, frankly, bizarre, but it added a spark of joy to the monotony of our workdays. Every Friday, we do a quick duck parade around the office to see whose duck looked the best, and the winner would get a silly little prize, like a coffee shop gift card or a box of chocolates. Around that time, I'd been toying with the idea of starting a side business, but I didn't have a clear direction. Then one night, As I was scrolling through photos of our duck parade on my phone, it hit me, people love these little ducks. What if I turned this whole thing into a business? The idea sounded ridiculous, but it was just crazy enough to work. So I started researching. Turns out there's an entire community of people who collect rubber ducks. People of all ages who appreciate the humor and nostalgia of those little plastic birds. Some collectors even organize duck swaps, where they trade rare or themed ducks. It was wild and I was fascinated. I decided to test the waters with a small online store called Ducks of Joy. I ordered a batch of unique rubber ducks from a supplier, starting with simple variations like ducks dressed as superheroes, pirates, and unicorns. I took some photos, made the website look as playful as possible, and put a few listings online. I didn't expect much. I just thought it would be a fun experiment, and maybe I'd sell a couple of ducks here and there. To my shock, I sold out of my first batch within a week. The orders came in faster than I could keep up, and people were emailing me asking when I'd restock or if I had specific duck designs. So I ordered more, expanding to different themes: holiday ducks, historical figure ducks, animals dressed as other animals. I even introduced a mystery duck option where people could get a random duck surprise in the mail. The feedback was incredible. People started tagging me on social media, sharing photos of their ducks of joy around their homes, on their desks, or as gifts for friends. Some people even created little duck scenes, arranging their ducks in tiny chairs or on makeshift duck beaches. The whole thing felt so absurd, but in the best way possible. Here was this joyful, silly thing bringing people together, and I was at the heart of it. Within a few months, I was getting regular orders, not just from individuals, but from small businesses and offices that wanted ducks for their teams or events. Companies would order dozens at a time, requesting themes that matched their brand or team culture. I created team duck kits that included small hats, capes, and accessories so people could personalize their ducks. One tech company even hired me to create custom tech duck kits for each department with little prop laptops and headphones, which was a huge hit at their annual retreat. Then one afternoon, I got an email from a big conference planning company. They were organizing a national event and wanted 1,000 custom ducks to hand out as fun little swag items. I remember reading that email, blinking a few times, and wondering if it was a prank. But after confirming the details, I realized this was my biggest order yet. Pulling it off was a whirlwind. I worked with a manufacturer to create custom designs, spent late nights assembling kits, and even roped in friends to help package and label each duck. When the final shipment went out, it felt like an accomplishment on par with completing a marathon. And the event company loved them. People went crazy over the ducks, taking them to panels, and even creating an unofficial hashtag Ducks of the Event, that trended for a few days on social media. That was when I knew I had to make this my full-time business. I left my corporate job, officially launched Ducks of Joy as a registered business, and poured everything I had into expanding it. I started creating custom themes for different holidays, limited edition ducks for seasons, and even collectible series like the Duck Adventurers. Think rubber ducks in tiny safari hats and backpacks. Now, Ducks of Joy has grown into something I never could have imagined. I have a small team, a bright little studio space where we pack orders, and a loyal customer base that keeps coming back for new releases. We host duck design contests where customers submit ideas, and the winning designs become part of our official collection. I even launched a subscription service, Duck of the Month Club, where members get a surprise duck and a small themed accessory each month. Every time I look around our studio, filled with boxes of ducks in every color and costume, I can't believe how far this little idea has come. What started as a silly office joke turned into something that brings a little happiness to people everywhere. I get messages from parents saying their kids collect my ducks, from teachers who use them as rewards, and from office workers who display them proudly on their desks. And whenever I send out a batch of ducks, I can't help but smile, imagining them making people laugh, brightening someone's day, or starting another silly tradition somewhere. Ducks of Joy has taught me that sometimes the simplest, silliest things can create the most happiness. So if you ever find yourself in a moment of doubt, remember that sometimes all it takes to change your life is a rubber duck and a sense of humor. You never know what little idea might be the start of something big. It was a chilly autumn night, One of those times when summer's fun is fading and everyone's settling back into routines. My best friend, Sam, invited me to his family's annual fall bonfire, a tradition going back years. His family's farm was the perfect spot: wide open fields, a huge fire pit, and enough space for everyone to unwind. His mom, Lisa, was hosting like always, bringing out food and laughing with all of us. Lisa had always been more than just a friend's mom. She was warm, easy to talk to, the type of person who could make anyone feel at home. Later that night, as people started heading out or drifting off to sleep, I stayed behind to help Lisa clean up. Sam had crashed early after one too many drinks, so it was just the two of us, stacking chairs, tossing bottles, both of us laughing at the chaos left behind. She poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets to keep warm. As we sipped, she started talking about her marriage, how things had been tough since Sam's dad left. She admitted that she'd been lonely, that the emptiness of the house sometimes felt unbearable. I told her I was always there if she needed anything, and she gave me this long, searching look like she was deciding something. She leaned in close, just talking softly about life, and I felt my heartbeat pick up. I didn't know if it was the late hour, the wine, or just the vulnerability between us. But when she touched my hand, I didn't pull away. The silence grew heavy, charged. I don't even know who leaned in first, but suddenly, we were kissing, something I'd never imagined would happen, yet couldn't seem to stop. We were both caught in it, the warmth of her touch, the feeling of doing something so forbidden it made my head spin. When we finally pulled apart, the reality hit. But instead of saying anything, she just gave a small, sad smile and walked inside. The next morning, I left before anyone else woke up, hoping to shake off the weirdness of it all. I figured we'd both pretend it never happened. But a few days later, Lisa texted me, saying she hoped we could talk. Against my better judgment, I went to see her, telling myself it was just a conversation. But when I got there, we didn't even make it past the front door before we were kissing again, this time without the hesitation. What followed were weeks of sneaking around, each meeting feeling riskier and more thrilling than the last. It was like we'd been pulled into some kind of secret world, and neither of us could bring ourselves to end it. But every time I saw Sam, the guilt gnawed at me, the lies piling up until they felt unbearable. It all came crashing down one night when Sam's younger sister, who still lived at home, found one of my jackets in Lisa's bedroom. Sam confronted me, asking why I'd been spending so much time with his mom, his eyes darkening as he started to put it together. I tried to come up with an excuse, but before I could, he just shook his head, his face twisted with disgust. "I trusted you," he muttered, his voice filled with hurt. After that, it was over. Sam cut me off, and Lisa ended things, both of us too ashamed to even try to patch things up. The friendship I'd had with Sam was gone, a casualty of a secret I'd never meant to keep. Now, every time I see a bonfire or feel the crisp air of fall, I'm reminded of that night and the line I crossed that changed everything forever. My friend Leo has this wild story from his time working as a night security guard at a massive, fancy museum downtown. He was usually there alone, tasked with making sure priceless artifacts stayed right where they were supposed to, so nights were mostly uneventful. But one evening, things took a turn that had him rethinking the job altogether. It was about 3 a.m., and Leo was doing his usual rounds in the dimly lit halls. He'd stopped by his favorite exhibit, a huge Egyptian collection with a towering statue of Anubis, the god of the underworld, right in the center. Leo always liked to joke that Anubis was his night shift buddy, since the statue had these eerie eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. He was giving his buddy the usual nod when he heard it, a strange scraping sound from the next room. He froze, heart pounding. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in the building. Creeping forward, Leo listened closely, trying to figure out what he was hearing. It was like something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by a soft thud. His first thought was that an animal had somehow gotten in, maybe a stray cat or raccoon. But as he got closer, he realized that this noise was much too big for any animal. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He finally reached the source of the noise, the medieval wing. Slowly, he pushed open the door, his flashlight sweeping over the dark room filled with ancient armor, swords, and tapestries. Then he saw it, a full suit of armor, normally displayed on a pedestal, had somehow ended up in the middle of the floor. It was like it had just walked off its stand and taken a midnight stroll. The helmet lay a few feet away, looking like it had been tossed aside. Leo's first instinct was that someone had broken in and was playing a prank, maybe some kids trying to have a laugh. But there was no sign of forced entry, and he was the only one who had access to the security room. Besides, the museum had sensors everywhere, and he hadn't gotten any alerts. As he stood there, trying to make sense of the scene, he suddenly heard a faint metallic clink from the far corner of the room. He whipped his flashlight over, heart pounding, expecting to see, well, he didn't know what he was expecting. But the light revealed nothing except rows of ancient shields and a wall lined with medieval weapons. Thinking he was going mad, he tried to calm himself, convincing himself he'd maybe left a door unlocked, or maybe it was a mouse that somehow nudged the armor just right. But as he turned to leave, he felt this strange, almost magnetic pull to look back. And when he did, he saw it, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. The helmet, which had been lying on the floor, was now upright, perfectly balanced on its edge, like it was watching him. He didn't think twice. Leo turned on his heel and booked it back to the security room, locking the door behind him. Once he was safely inside, he pulled up the camera feed, scanning the footage to see if he'd really seen what he thought he had. But in every frame, the armor was back in its original position, helmet and all, right where it should have been, as if nothing had happened. He replayed the footage over and over, convinced he'd missed something. But no, according to the cameras, the suit of armor hadn't moved an inch all night. From that night on, Leo started carrying a little good luck charm in his pocket, a tiny Egyptian amulet he'd bought from a gift shop years ago, whenever he worked late shifts. He never told anyone about what he saw, or didn't see. But he swears that suit of armor has a mind of its own. Anytime someone asks if his job is boring, Leo just laughs and says, "Trust me, the museum has a life of its own after dark." On my first day as a caretaker at an upscale retirement home, I had no idea what I was in for. I'd worked with the elderly before, but this place was something else entirely. A luxury residence for seniors who had spent their lives as CEOs, artists, and professors. The building was immaculate, decorated like a mansion, with marble floors, chandeliers, and rooms that looked more like suites in a five-star hotel than a retirement community. The residents here were lively, to put it mildly. My orientation guide, Louisa, was an upbeat nurse who had worked there for years. She was bursting with energy, bouncing from one end of the hall to the other while briefing me on each resident. "Now, just a heads up," she said, "this place is like high school, but with more attitude and a lot more stories." I laughed, thinking she was kidding. But by the end of that first day, I knew exactly what she meant. My first task was to bring breakfast to Mr. Baxter, a retired professor who had a reputation for being a little particular. His room was a miniature library, with books crammed into every corner and piles of old journals stacked high. I knocked, and he opened the door, looking me up and down with sharp, assessing eyes. "Ah," he said, as if he'd expected someone else. "Are you the new one?" I nodded, trying to keep my cool, and he just sighed, waving me in. He requested his eggs a precise shade of soft scrambled that I somehow managed to deliver, and he gave me a curt nod of approval before launching into a monologue about existentialism that left me questioning my own reality by the time I left his room. Just as I thought I was getting the hang of things, I was called to assist Mrs. Florence, an 80-something former Broadway actress known for her grand entrances and exits. When I knocked, she flung the door open, dressed head to toe in a velvet robe with dramatic sleeves and a glittering brooch. "Darling," she said, taking my hand as if we were old friends, "I need help deciding on the right perfume. One must smell exquisite, you understand." She led me to her dresser, which was covered in perfume bottles of every color and shape. We spent a good 20 minutes sniffing each one, with her narrating tales of her past loves and glamorous adventures in New York. She finally settled on one, spritzed herself generously, and whispered conspiratorially, "They say life's lost its thrill here, but honey, they don't know Florence." She gave me a wink, and I left, half expecting her to break into a song and dance number. By lunchtime, I thought I might have a chance to catch my breath, but that was wishful thinking. I was sent to the garden, where Mr. Ramirez, a former pilot with a mischievous streak, liked to spend his afternoons. I found him sitting by the koi pond, squinting up at the sky. When he saw me, he grinned and motioned for me to join him. "Did they tell you I was in the Air Force?" he asked with a gleam in his eye. Back then, I was the best pilot they had. Flew over 5 continents. I nodded politely, listening to his stories, which were both fascinating and slightly embellished, if I had to guess. But he was such a charmer that I found myself captivated anyway. Then, in the middle of a story about a particularly daring mission, he leaned over and whispered, "Want to know a secret?" I leaned in, intrigued, and he pointed at the koi pond. "See that big one? I call him Captain. He's the ringleader of the whole pond. I talk to him every day." He chuckled, and for the next few minutes, I watched him carry on a conversation with Captain the Koi Fish, telling him about his escapades like they were old war buddies. I left with a smile, wondering how long he'd been spinning stories to that fish. The day was nearly over when I got one last call to check on Mrs. Reynolds, a sweet but very forgetful woman who was known to occasionally wander off. When I found her, she was trying to bake a pie in her kitchenette, but instead of pie ingredients, she had filled the mixing bowl with coins, buttons, and a random assortment of sewing pins. She looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. "Is it time for the county fair?" she asked, as if I might know the answer. I gently led her away, promising to help her with the pie another time, and she patted my hand, calling me her favorite grandchild, even though we'd only just met. As the sun began to set, I finally sat down in the staff room, exhausted but oddly fulfilled. Louisa came by, giving me a knowing smile. "So," she asked, "survived the first day?" I laughed, nodding, but words didn't really do justice to what I'd just experienced. These people weren't just residents. They were full of stories, quirks, and passions that were alive and vivid, even if their bodies didn't always keep up with their spirits. They were like characters out of a novel, each with their own plot twists and secrets. Walking out of the facility, I realized that this job was going to be an adventure. I wasn't just there to take care of them. I was there to witness a world brimming with life, where every hallway held tales of love, loss, and laughter. I knew they'd keep me on my toes, but I also knew they'd leave me with stories I'd carry long after I left. The rain had just started as I ducked into a tiny, cozy-looking bookstore to escape the sudden downpour. I wasn't even looking for anything to buy. I just wanted a dry place to wait out the storm. The shop was quiet, smelling of old paper and coffee, and it felt like stepping back in time. I wandered between the shelves, running my fingers along the spines, when a voice spoke up nearby. "Looking for something specific, or just hiding from the rain?" I turned to see a guy leaning against a bookshelf, his hands in his pockets and a slightly amused smile on his face. He had the kind of easy confidence that made it look like he belonged there. "A bit of both, actually," I replied, shrugging. "It's either this or sprinting home," which didn't sound appealing. I glanced at his feet, noticing he was wearing drenched sneakers. "Though, it looks like you didn't make it in time." He looked down and laughed, caught in the first wave. I was just standing here waiting for my shoes to dry before committing to the fiction section. I laughed, appreciating the shared absurdity of our situation. "Well, as long as we're both stranded, I'm Emily," I offered, holding out my hand. "Nice to meet you, Emily," he said, shaking my hand with a warm smile. "I'm Mac's stranded bookshop friend." We chatted about the storm, both trying to pretend we weren't glancing out the window every few minutes to check if it was letting up. After a while, he motioned to a worn leather couch in the corner. "Want to grab a seat? Seems like we're in for a bit of a wait." I agreed, and we settled in, surrounded by shelves stacked with novels and biographies. He picked up a random book from the coffee table, flipping through it idly as we talked. We swapped stories about the strangest books we'd ever read, the worst movies we loved anyway, and the dream vacations we hadn't taken yet. At one point, he held up a book on local ghost stories with a raised eyebrow. "So, Emily," he began in a mock-serious tone, "do you believe in ghosts?" "Obviously," I replied, trying to look equally serious. "I mean, doesn't everyone?" "Good," he said, nodding approvingly, because I was about to suggest a ghost hunt through the bookstore. I hear the rare bargain bin phantom only appears on stormy nights. We spent the next 20 minutes making up increasingly ridiculous ghost stories about the haunted bookstore. I pointed out a dusty copy of an old atlas and claimed it was cursed, that anyone who bought it would forget all their geography. He insisted the little bell over the door was enchanted to let only hopeless romantics inside. Somewhere in the middle of it all, I realized I was having more fun than I'd had in ages. Finally, after what felt like hours, the rain lightened to a drizzle. We both looked toward the door a little reluctantly. "Looks like our storm adventure's over," he said, glancing back at me with a grin. "Thanks for making this the most entertaining rain delay I've ever had." "Likewise," I replied, smiling. "And hey, if you ever need a partner for a real ghost hunt." He laughed, pulling out his phone and handing it to me. "I'll hold you to that. Give me your number, and we'll plan something spooky. Or at least something dry." I typed in my number, handing it back with a grin. "Deal. But only if we find somewhere equally atmospheric." We stood there, hesitating a moment too long, before he finally gave a small wave. "Catch you later, Emily." As I watched him walk out into the misty evening, I felt a strange, hopeful excitement bubbling up. The rain might have been miserable, but that unexpected encounter in a hidden bookstore had made it worth every single drop. It was supposed to be a simple afternoon coffee. Just me, sitting in a cafe, working through emails, ticking off my usual to-do list. But that day, I ended up sitting next to an older man with a look in his eyes that I can only describe as somewhere else. Not lost or sad, but like he was carrying a whole other world in his mind. I noticed him because he'd ordered a black coffee and nothing else, then sat there, quietly watching everyone around him. After a few minutes, he pulled out a small leather-bound journal and started flipping through the pages, a little smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I went back to my work, but something about him kept catching my attention. I'm not usually one to strike up conversations with strangers, but he looked over at me and gave me a friendly nod, so I nodded back. He gestured to my laptop. "Busy day?" I smiled, shrugging. "Always." He nodded knowingly, then said, "You know, people think you need a big plan to live a good life. But sometimes it's just about noticing things, like how you're here working, but you're looking out the window every other minute, as if you're somewhere else." I blinked, surprised at how right he was. "You're not wrong. It happens to all of us," he said with a chuckle. "Sometimes you have to be pulled out of your life to see it clearly." I didn't know what he meant, but it sparked something in me, a feeling like I should stick around, hear him out. I closed my laptop, leaned back, and asked, "So, what do you do?" "Oh, I'm retired," he said. "But before that, I worked as a watchmaker. Spent most of my life fixing old watches, one piece at a time." He took a sip of his coffee, then continued. "People don't realize it, but fixing a watch is an art. There's a kind of beauty in the way all those tiny gears work together, keeping perfect time. But here's the thing. The smallest piece, the one no one notices, that's the one that keeps it all moving." He looked down at his journal, almost like he was talking to himself now. Sometimes we miss those small parts of ourselves that keep us going, lose them, and the whole system starts to break down, even if you don't notice it right away. I was quiet, absorbing his words. I hadn't been expecting a metaphor about life from a stranger in a coffee shop, but there it was, sitting in front of me like a gift. He looked up, as if realizing he'd said too much. "Sorry, I can get a little philosophical sometimes." No, I actually really needed to hear that." I admitted, surprised at myself for being so open with him. "I feel like I've lost those small pieces lately. Everything just feels off." He gave me a sympathetic nod. "Have you ever tried traveling alone?" I raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. "Traveling alone? Like just going somewhere by myself?" He nodded. "I've done it for years, since I was about your age. Sometimes a new place helps you see things differently. You step out of your own patterns, find parts of yourself you might have forgotten. And there's something special about having only your own company to keep." It was such a simple suggestion, yet it hit me like a revelation. I'd always traveled with friends or family, filling every trip with plans and itineraries, never just wandering on my own. The idea of doing it alone, without anyone else's expectations, felt intimidating but oddly thrilling. Before I could stop myself, I blurted out, Where would you go if you were me? He smiled, clearly pleased. Well, I could give you 1,000 suggestions, but I think the right place will come to you. It always does. The important thing is to be open to it. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes before he stood up to leave. Just as he was about to walk out, he turned back to me and said, "Trust the journey, even if you don't know where it leads. Sometimes the best discoveries are the ones you don't plan." And with that, he left, disappearing into the busy street outside. I sat there, turning his words over in my mind. The idea of traveling alone, of breaking away from my routine, was growing more tempting by the second. So, on a whim, I went home, opened my laptop, and booked a train ticket to a small coastal town I'd always heard about, but had never visited. I didn't know anyone there, didn't even have a place to stay yet, but I figured I'd figure it out along the way. The next weekend, I found myself on a train, watching the countryside roll by, feeling more alive and uncertain than I had in years. There was something liberating about not having a plan, about not knowing anyone or anything about the place I was headed to. I'd packed light, just a notebook, a few clothes, and a camera I hadn't used in ages. When I arrived, I spent the first day wandering aimlessly, walking through little markets, stopping in tiny cafes, watching the locals go about their day. It felt like the world had slowed down, as if life here moved to a different rhythm. And in that quiet, I felt pieces of myself I hadn't noticed in years. Simple things, like the way I loved to sit by the sea, or how I could get lost in a book for hours when no one was rushing me. On the second day, I found a small lookout point on a cliff, where I sat with my journal, scribbling down whatever came to mind. Thoughts, memories, even questions that had been lurking in the back of my mind for ages. It was like the quiet of that place was giving me the space to be honest with myself, to face parts of me I'd been too busy to notice. One evening, I met a woman at a seaside cafe. She was a painter, traveling around the coast for inspiration, and we struck up an easy conversation. She spoke about her work with such passion, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that way about anything I was doing. She looked at me at one point and said, "You seem like you're searching for something." "I think I am," I admitted, almost surprised at myself for saying it out loud. She smiled. "We all are, aren't we?" We talked until the cafe closed, and as I walked back to my little room, her words lingered. It struck me that maybe searching wasn't something to fix or solve. Maybe it was just a part of being alive, a constant process of rediscovery. By the end of the trip, I felt different, not in a grand, life-altering way, but in small, almost invisible ways, like I'd reconnected with parts of myself I'd forgotten. When I returned home, I didn't want to dive straight back into the rush. I kept the habit of taking long walks, of giving myself quiet mornings to think and write. I even started picking up old hobbies, the things that brought me joy, not because they'd help me get ahead, but just because they felt like little pieces of me. Sometimes I think about that man in the cafe and wonder who he was, why he felt the need to share those thoughts with me that day. I never saw him again, but his words stayed with me, reminding me that sometimes the smallest encounters can have the biggest impact. And every now and then, I book a solo trip to a place I've never been, leaving my plans at home, just to remind myself that the world is bigger than my routine. Because he was right. Sometimes the best discoveries are the ones we don't plan, the moments we didn't see coming, the people we meet by chance who end up changing everything. This happened on a cold night last November. I was walking home from a late shift, the streets nearly empty and silent, wrapped in that eerie calm that only comes when the world is asleep. As I rounded the corner to my block, I noticed something strange, a small, glowing sign flickering in the window of a tiny shop that I had never seen before. The timekeeper's shop, it read in delicate, looping script. Beneath it, there was a small line in smaller letters. Memories bought, sold, and traded. I stopped, feeling an inexplicable pull. This shop hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. It was in the spot where I always passed an empty storefront, its windows dusty and dark. But tonight, the shop looked warmly lit, inviting, the faint scent of something like old wood and faint perfume wafting out into the street. Without fully deciding to, I stepped inside. A bell chimed softly as the door closed behind me. The shop was small, the walls lined with shelves, each one filled with beautiful antique clocks, pocket watches, hourglasses, and strange glass orbs that seemed to hum with a faint light. The air was thick with a sense of age and mystery, as if the very room held its breath in anticipation. Behind the counter stood a man in a suit that looked as old as the clocks on the walls. His hair was silver, neatly combed, and his eyes, sharp and clear, held an intensity that made me feel he knew something about me already. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "You must be looking for something." "I just came in out of curiosity," I replied, though I felt a bit ridiculous. "Who walks into a shop that didn't exist yesterday out of curiosity?" He smiled slightly, as if he'd heard the same line many times before. "Curiosity is what brings most people here. And sometimes it's the only thing that brings us to what we need." He motioned toward a small display case at the center of the room. Inside were various items, rings, keys, coins, even old photos. Each one was labeled with a small tag, neatly handwritten. "What are these?" I asked, leaning closer. "Memories," he said simply. "People bring them here to be kept or to be traded for something they need more." I looked up at him, surprised. "Memories? You mean actual memories?" He nodded, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Not everyone wants to hold on to every memory. Some memories become too heavy, too painful. Others fade and lose their clarity. Here, people can exchange them or simply leave them behind." He pointed to an old locket on a velvet cushion, its silver tarnished but beautiful. "That one," he said, "holds a memory of a love that ended. The owner couldn't bear the weight of it anymore, so he left it here in exchange for peace." I felt a strange shiver as I looked at the locket. There was something so sad, yet strangely comforting about the idea of a place where memories could be left, exchanged like trinkets. My gaze drifted over the other items in the case, each one whispering of forgotten moments, hidden histories. "Would you like to leave something behind?" he asked, watching me with those piercing eyes. I opened my mouth to say no, but then hesitated. I thought of the things I carried with me, the memories that lingered in the corners of my mind, gathering dust but never fading. There was one in particular, an old, unresolved memory that weighed heavily on me. It was from years ago, a friendship that had ended abruptly, painfully, without explanation. I'd spent countless nights wondering where things had gone wrong, but I could never find closure. The loss felt like a scar, something that couldn't heal because I kept reopening it, trying to make sense of it. I looked at the shopkeeper, feeling a strange mix of hope and fear. "If I leave something here, will I forget it?" He shook his head. "No, you won't forget it entirely. You'll remember that it happened, but the weight of it will lift. It will become like a distant dream, something you can look back on without the pain." It was tempting, more tempting than I wanted to admit, but something held me back. What if I leave it and regret it?" I asked, feeling almost foolish. He considered this, nodding thoughtfully. "Then perhaps you're not ready to let it go." "Not yet, but if you decide to, you're welcome to leave it here." He gestured to a small book on the counter, its pages yellowed with age. "For those who need time to decide, we offer an alternative. Here, you can store a memory temporarily. If after a month you still wish to leave it, it will be kept here. If not, you may take it back." Something about the offer felt right. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief as he handed me a pen. "Write it down," he said. "It doesn't have to be every detail, just enough to capture the essence." I opened the book to a blank page, the paper soft beneath my fingers. I took a deep breath and began writing about that friendship, about the laughter, the late nights, the shared dreams, and finally about the hurt, the silence, the unanswered questions. I wrote it all down, letting the words pour out of me like a confession. When I finished, the shopkeeper took the book from me and nodded approvingly. "It's done," he said, closing the book gently. "You may come back in a month if you still feel the need." I thanked him, feeling lighter as I stepped outside. The cold night air hit me, bracing and clear, and I realized that the ache I'd carried for years was softer, like a bruise that was finally healing. For the first time in ages, I felt like I could breathe. A month passed, And though I thought about the memory often, it didn't haunt me the way it once had. The edges softened, the weight lifted. I knew then that I didn't need to go back to the shop. I was ready to let it stay there, held safely in that strange book, its pain no longer a part of me. Still, every so often, I walked down that street, hoping to see the timekeeper's shop again, wondering if it was real or just a vivid dream. But each time, I find only that empty storefront, the windows dark and dusty, as though no one had entered in years. But I know it was real because the memory remains with me, soft and distant, like a shadow in the back of my mind, a reminder that sometimes the things we hold on to are heavier than we realize, and that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means making room for new memories, for new pieces of ourselves we haven't yet discovered. And maybe that's all the timekeeper's shop was meant to do, to remind us that some burdens are meant to be shared, even if only with the quiet walls of a mysterious little shop on an empty street. This happened late one night in a city I barely knew. I was traveling for work, exhausted from a day of meetings, and after lying awake in my hotel bed for hours, I decided I couldn't stand the quiet of the room any longer. The clock on the nightstand read 2:17 a.m., but I pulled on my coat and slipped outside anyway, thinking a walk might clear my head. The city was eerie at that hour, quiet and empty, like it was holding its breath. I wandered through side streets and alleyways, the kind of places I'd normally avoid, but that night I didn't care. There was something restless in me, an itch I couldn't scratch, like I was searching for something without knowing what it was. I turned a corner and found myself on a narrow street lined with old shops, most of them shuttered. But one of them caught my eye, a little bookstore tucked between two larger buildings, its lights still on. The sign above the door read "Tomorrow's" in faded gold letters. Curious, I walked over to the door, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it opened. Inside, the shop was warm and inviting, filled with that comforting smell of old paper and leather. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with books that looked like they'd been sitting there for decades. The place was empty, except for a man at the counter, flipping through an old hardcover. He looked up as I entered, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was older, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that seemed at home among dusty bookshelves. "Good evening," he said, his voice low and gentle, like he'd been waiting for someone to wander in. "Good evening," I replied, feeling a little self-conscious. I didn't expect to find a bookstore open at this hour. He chuckled softly. "This isn't just any bookstore. We're only open for those who need us." His words hung in the air, strange and cryptic, but there was something about his tone that made it feel perfectly normal. I looked around, taking in the shelves stacked high with books of every color and size. "What kind of books do you sell here?" I asked. He smiled, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "We specialize in tomorrows." I stared at him, not quite sure if I'd heard him correctly. "Tomorrows?" "Indeed." He gestured to the shelves. "Each book here holds a story that hasn't yet happened. They're not memories you see, but possibilities." I laughed, thinking he must be joking, but he didn't laugh with me. He just looked at me with a steady, patient gaze, as if he knew something I didn't. Part of me wanted to walk out, to laugh it off and go back to the hotel, but another part of me was intrigued. "Would you like to see one?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I nodded, more out of curiosity than belief. He walked over to a shelf, scanned it for a moment, and pulled down a slim, dark book with no title on the cover. He handed it to me, and as soon as I touched it, I felt a strange warmth, like the book was alive in my hands. "Go on," he said. "Open it." I hesitated, then flipped open the cover. Inside was a handwritten date, March 15th, 2026. My heart skipped a beat. That was 4 years from now. I flipped to the first page where a sentence greeted me. "On this day, you will stand on a beach at sunrise, watching the waves with someone who changes everything." I felt a chill run through me. I didn't even know where I'd be for years from now, let alone who I'd be with. But as I read the words, I could picture it so clearly, standing on a quiet beach, feeling the cold sand under my feet, watching the light break over the horizon. And next to me, a shadow, a presence I couldn't quite see, but that felt familiar. I looked up at the man, searching his face for an explanation. "Is this a prediction?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "Not a prediction, a possibility. One of the many paths your life might take." I closed the book, my fingers tracing the smooth cover. "How can it be possible to see something that hasn't happened?" He smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Tomorrows aren't set in stone. They're like rivers, branching and flowing in all directions. Some currents are stronger than others. When you're drawn to a particular book, it means a certain path is calling to you." I held the book tightly, feeling a strange longing rise in me. I'd been drifting in my life, uncertain of where I was headed, but something about that image, a quiet beach, the first light of morning, and the sense of someone beside me, felt so achingly right. It was as if the book had shown me a part of myself I hadn't yet discovered. The man must have sensed my thoughts because he spoke softly. "Keep it if you like. It'll remind you that you're always free to choose your own tomorrow." I felt a rush of gratitude, though I didn't fully understand why. I slipped the book into my bag, feeling its comforting weight against me. "Thank you," I said, my voice filled with sincerity. "I think I needed this." He nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "Most people do. Just remember, it's not the book that creates the future. That part is up to you." I left the bookstore feeling as though I'd been given a gift, a glimpse into a future I could choose if I was brave enough to follow it. The streets were still empty, and as I walked back to my hotel, the silence felt different, more alive. I didn't know if I'd ever find that bookstore again, or if it would vanish into the city's shadows. But I knew I'd keep that book with me, a reminder that I wasn't bound by my past or present, that there were endless tomorrows waiting, if only I dared to reach for them. That night, back at the hotel, I sat by the window and opened the book again, rereading those first lines. I imagined the ocean's vastness stretching before me, the sunrise slowly coloring the sky. And I decided then and there that I would live as if that tomorrow were real, that I'd make choices that would lead me to that quiet beach, to that person who would change everything. And even if that exact moment never came to pass, I knew I was already different, braver somehow, with the knowledge that life could be rewritten one tomorrow at a time. By senior year, we were practically famous for our ridiculous stunts, so naturally, we saved our biggest prank for the very last week of school. The idea was born in the middle of a boring study hall when my friend Alex muttered, "You know what this place needs? A pool." Now, we didn't exactly have the funds or, permission to install a pool, but that didn't stop us. Our plan? Turn the entire school's main hallway into a giant indoor beach party. We spent days gathering supplies, sandbags, inflatable pool toys, beach balls, and yes, an absurd amount of sand. Trevor, who always seemed to know someone for everything, had an uncle in landscaping who loaned us the sand for the night. We weren't entirely sure how we'd get it all in without raising suspicions, but Alex assured us that with the right amount of chaos, it would work. The night before the last day of school, about a dozen of us sneaked in through a side door left accidentally unlocked by our buddy who did after-school janitorial work. We wheeled in 5 giant bags of sand and dumped it all over the main hallway, spreading it out until we had a solid inch of beach stretching from one end to the other. Then we set up beach chairs, umbrellas, and a kiddie pool filled with water in the middle of the hall, tossing inflatable flamingos and pool noodles all around. Someone even brought a boombox with ocean sounds, and we positioned it near the entrance like it was our personal surf soundtrack. The piece de resistance was the palm tree. One of us had found this inflatable palm tree at a dollar store, and we duct-taped it to a floor sign so it would stand upright, giving the whole place an authentic beach vibe. We worked through the night, laughing and spreading sand while constantly shushing each other. By 5 a.m., we had transformed our dull, fluorescent-lit hallway into a sandy paradise. When the morning bell rang, the look on everyone's faces was priceless. Teachers walked in and just stopped, staring as if they were hallucinating. Students burst out laughing, some immediately dropping their bags to jump into the pool and lounge on the inflatable chairs. Someone even tossed a beach ball that started a full-on volleyball match in the middle of the hall. The boombox was blasting fake seagull sounds, and the entire senior class was practically throwing a beach party while the underclassmen looked on in total awe. Then, as expected, Principal Reeves stormed in, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than dealing with our insanity. He took a deep breath, lifted his bullhorn, and bellowed, "Seniors, if you value graduation, start cleaning up this mess." But even he couldn't hide the smirk that slipped through as he watched one kid float by on a blow-up dolphin. As we started to sweep up the sand and haul away beach toys, Mr. Carter, our cool physics teacher, walked by with a grin and said, "Best prank I've seen yet. They'll be talking about this for years." And he was right. By the time the day ended, the legend of the senior beach takeover had spread, cementing us as the class that brought the beach to school. When graduation day came, we walked the stage with bits of sand still stuck in our sneakers, forever a part of our high school beach party legacy. It was supposed to be a quick run to the grocery store, but I'd made the rookie mistake of going in without a list, and now I was wandering the aisles, completely lost. I'd already picked up a bizarre assortment of things I didn't need. A bag of mini marshmallows, a jar of capers, and a can of pumpkin puree, when I heard a voice next to me. Planning a feast? Or just preparing for the apocalypse? I looked over to see a guy standing there, grinning at my basket with obvious amusement. He was holding a carton of milk in one hand and a giant block of cheddar in the other, like he'd already mastered the art of decisive grocery shopping. Both," I replied, glancing down at the chaos in my basket. "It's a highly strategic combination of snacks, and who am I kidding? I have no idea what I'm doing." He laughed, setting his milk and cheese in his own basket. "You're talking to the king of impulse grocery shopping. I once bought 5 jars of olives because they were on sale and then realized I don't even like olives." I chuckled, grateful for the shared ridiculousness. Nice to know I'm not alone in my grocery mishaps. "I'm Sarah, by the way, unofficial queen of pointless snacks." "Nice to meet you, Sarah. I'm Leo, accidental olive hoarder," he replied, giving a mock bow. We continued talking as we wandered through the aisles, both of us still half focused on the task at hand. Leo had a way of turning the most mundane decisions, like which pasta shape was superior, into lively debates, and before I knew it, we were discussing everything from cereal brands to the absolute necessity of chocolate chips in any emergency grocery haul. "So, what's the deal with the pumpkin puree?" he asked, pointing to the can in my basket as we lingered by the baking aisle. I shrugged, laughing. Honestly, I saw it, and I thought, hey, maybe I'll make a pie or something. But I don't even have a recipe, and I'm probably going to forget about it until next fall. He nodded, pretending to look serious. Classic rookie mistake. You should know pumpkin puree is like the Bermuda Triangle of the pantry. Stuff goes in, but it never comes back out. As we continued our grocery escapade, Leo somehow convinced me that we needed to pick out ingredients to make the world's best grilled cheese sandwiches. We debated endlessly over which bread and cheese would make the perfect combination, even grabbing a few extras like fancy mustard and a little packet of basil. "This is officially the most thought I've ever put into a grilled cheese," I said, holding a loaf of sourdough like it was a prized artifact. "Well, consider yourself enlightened," he replied with a laugh. "Grilled cheese isn't just a sandwich. It's an art form." Finally, with our grilled cheese masterpieces ready to go, we made our way to the checkout. As we stood in line, he glanced over, looking almost shy for the first time. "This was fun," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know, way more fun than my usual grocery runs." I nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the bright lights of the store. "Same here. I don't usually end up with half the ingredients for a gourmet sandwich and a new grocery buddy." He smiled, holding out his phone. "How about we actually make these grilled cheese masterpieces sometime? I mean, it would be a tragedy to let all this planning go to waste." I took his phone, entering my number with a grin. "I'm in. Just promise you won't add olives." He laughed, taking his phone back. "Only if you promise not to let the pumpkin puree go to waste." We parted ways in the parking lot, each of us pushing a cart full of random groceries that suddenly felt full of possibilities. As I watched him wave before driving off, I realized that my quick trip to the grocery store had turned into something unexpectedly wonderful. And as I drove home, I couldn't stop smiling, already looking forward to the most over-the-top grilled cheese night of my life. We'd been friends since we were kids. Neighbors who bonded over our shared love for building elaborate tree forts and spending whole afternoons lost in imaginary worlds. As we grew older, our interests shifted from forts to music, from imaginary games to real late-night talks about life and our dreams. He became my person, the one constant in my life as everything else changed. Through high school, we were practically joined at the hip, and people always assumed there was something romantic between us. We'd laugh it off, insisting we were just friends, both of us rolling our eyes at the idea. College took us to different cities, but we still stayed close, texting constantly, sending each other memes and photos of random things that reminded us of home. We'd see each other during holidays, and every time, it was like no time had passed. I thought I knew everything about him, every look, every laugh, every mood. But there was one thing I didn't see coming. It happened the summer after we graduated. We were back home, both of us unsure about our next steps, both a little lost. He came over one night, like he'd done 1,000 times before, and we sat on my porch, talking for hours. The air was thick with the smell of summer, and as we sat there, he reached for my hand. At first, I didn't think much of it. Holding hands wasn't unusual for us. But then he looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I'd never noticed before. "What if," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "what if we're meant to be more than friends?" My heart skipped, my mind racing. I wanted to laugh it off, make a joke, but the look on his face stopped me. He was serious, his gaze steady, and I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't quite name. I didn't answer right away. We sat there in silence, both of us too scared to move, too afraid to say the wrong thing. Finally, he leaned in and kissed me, a soft, hesitant kiss that felt both thrilling and terrifying. It was a kiss that was years in the making, one that felt both inevitable and completely shocking. The days that followed were a blur. We tried to act normal, pretending like we could just go back to the way things were. But every time we were together, there was a tension, a question hanging in the air that neither of us wanted to voice. We'd laugh, joke, talk about everything like we always did, but there was this feeling between us, something fragile and unspoken. Then one night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Are we really going to pretend that nothing's changed?" He looked at me, his face full of uncertainty, and for a second, I thought he'd brush it off. But instead, he took my hand and said, "I don't know where this is going, but I know I don't want to lose you. I don't want to go back to pretending." Hearing him say it out loud was like a release. All the fears, all the doubts, they faded away, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel what I'd been holding back. I realized then that he wasn't just my best friend. He was so much more. He was the person who had been by my side through everything, the person who had seen me at my worst and still chose to be there. We decided to take things slow, try not to label it, try not to let the pressure of what if ruin what we had. Our friendship grew into something deeper, something we both cherished but were still a little scared of. I thought I'd be nervous, but with him, everything felt natural, easy, like this was the way it was always meant to be. We'd spend hours talking, laughing, sharing parts of ourselves we'd never dared to before. But it wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when I'd wonder if we were making a mistake, if this would somehow ruin the friendship that had been the foundation of my life for so long. He had those fears too, and sometimes we'd argue. Sometimes we'd question whether we were doing the right thing. But every time, we'd come back to each other, realizing that what we had was too rare, too beautiful to let go. A year later, we're still together. He's my best friend, my partner, my favorite person in the world. We still have our old jokes, our little traditions, the things that make us who we are. But now, there's something more, a closeness that goes beyond anything I'd ever imagined. Sometimes I'll catch him looking at me with this quiet smile, and I know he's thinking the same thing. That we've somehow managed to find a love that's both steady and exhilarating, both new and familiar. It's not the fairy tale romance I once dreamed of, but it's real, it's ours, and it's better than anything I could have imagined. We often laugh about how long it took us to get here, how many years we spent pretending we were just friends. And maybe we needed those years. Maybe we needed to grow into this. All I know is that, looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Because he's not just my best friend, he's my home. And every day, I'm grateful that we were brave enough to take a chance on each other, to trust that what we'd found was worth the risk. All right, here's one last one for you. My buddy Evan has this story from his time working at a car rental agency at the airport, and it's the kind of experience that sounds almost too bizarre to be real. He was used to dealing with all sorts of odd customers, but this one took the cake and left him questioning everything about the job. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and the place was dead, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers. Evan was getting ready to close out his shift when a man in a bright orange suit strode up to the counter, soaking wet, but grinning like he'd just found the meaning of life. The man had no luggage, no umbrella, just this strange energy that immediately put Evan on edge. The guy leaned over the counter and, with a serious face, said, "I need a car. The biggest one you've got." He pulled out a thick wad of cash and slapped it on the counter without a word. Evan blinked, a bit taken aback because almost no one pays in cash for rentals these days. But he shrugged and started the paperwork, going through the usual questions: driver's license, insurance, length of rental. Everything seemed mostly normal until he asked, "So, how long will you need the car?" The man grinned even wider and said, "Just for tonight. I have a mission." Evan stifled a laugh, trying to stay professional, and asked what kind of car he wanted. Without missing a beat, the guy replied, "An SUV. Black, with tinted windows. And it needs to be fast." Evan explained that their SUVs were big, but not exactly built for speed. The guy just nodded and said, "Good enough." So Evan hands him the keys to one of their largest SUVs, figuring he'll return it the next day, and that'll be that. But just as the guy is about to leave, he pauses, turns back, and asks, "By the way, do you have any costumes? Something like a cape?" Evan thought it was a joke, but the guy's face was dead serious, so Evan, trying not to laugh, told him the agency didn't have costumes on hand. The guy shrugged, gave Evan a conspiratorial wink, and strode off into the rain with his rented SUV. The next morning, Evan came back for his shift, half expecting the SUV to be sitting in the return lot. But there was nothing. Hours passed, and still no sign of the guy. Evan started to get a little nervous because, technically, the guy hadn't left any contact information other than his driver's license. Finally, near the end of the day, the SUV rolled up. It looked like it had been through a war zone. Mud caked on the wheels, a few mysterious dents on the side, and what appeared to be the faint outline of handprints on the hood. The guy stepped out, his orange suit even more disheveled and now sporting a tear along one sleeve, looking like he'd just been on a midnight adventure. Evan couldn't help himself. He asked, "Rough night?" The guy chuckled, slipping him a generous tip, and said, "Let's just say the city is safer now." He tossed the keys back, gave Evan a two-finger salute, and walked off without a backward glance. Evan never did find out what that guy was up to that night. All he had were the vague memories of that mission and the image of those muddy handprints left behind on the SUV. And to this day, whenever someone asks about his weirdest rental experience, Evan just smiles and says there was this one guy who might have actually saved the city. We'd known each other since middle school. He was the kid with the loud laugh who somehow found a way to be friends with everyone, and I was the shy, artsy girl who preferred doodling in the margins to talking to people. Somehow we just clicked. By high school, we were inseparable. Our friendship was effortless, built on years of inside jokes, shared secrets, and an unspoken loyalty. We were each other's constant, through breakups, moves, college rejections, and every other heartbreak that teenage life could throw at us. And somewhere along the way, we became each other's person. We went to different colleges, both trying to carve out our own lives, but always staying connected. Long calls, endless texts, visits when we could swing them. No matter how busy or far away we were, we never lost each other. We both dated other people, and I convinced myself that whatever I felt for him was just friendship. He'd tell me about his latest crush, and I'd laugh, genuinely happy for him. At least, that's what I told myself. One night, a few years after we'd both graduated, he invited me to his place for a movie night. It was a normal Friday tradition we'd started in high school, and it felt good to be back in our rhythm. We got takeout, picked a terrible action movie, and settled into his couch, talking through the scenes like we always did. But then he leaned his head against mine, just a simple gesture, and something changed. I suddenly felt hyper-aware of how close we were, of how my heart was racing. I tried to brush it off, but as the movie played on, I realized he wasn't pulling away. I glanced over at him, and he was looking at me, really looking at me like he was trying to figure something out. My heart started pounding, and before I could overthink it, I leaned in and kissed him. It was soft and hesitant, like we were testing something we didn't quite understand. When he kissed me back, it felt like the world shifted, like something that had always been there was finally coming into focus. We spent the night talking, laughing, holding each other like it was the most natural thing in the world. I kept thinking, how did I not see this before? How did I not know? The sun was starting to rise by the time we fell asleep, tangled in each other, and for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. But the morning brought a different kind of reality. We were both terrified of what this meant, of what we could lose if it didn't work. We tiptoed around it, each too afraid to ask the other if this was a mistake. In the days that followed, we tried to pretend nothing had changed, that we could just laugh it off and go back to the way things were. But every time we saw each other, the tension was there, like a secret we couldn't ignore. One night, after too many drinks at a friend's party, I pulled him aside and blurted out, "Do you regret it?" That night, he looked at me, eyes wide, and shook his head. "Not for a second. Do you?" I felt a weight lift off my chest, and I shook my head, relieved and terrified all at once. We stood there, silent, both of us realizing that this was real, that we couldn't just bury it and hope it went away. We decided to give it a shot to see where it went. We knew it was risky, that we could be ruining years of friendship, but there was something undeniable about the way we felt. Being with him was like stepping into something I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. There were no awkward getting-to-know-you phases, no pretenses, just us, two people who'd known each other inside and out, suddenly discovering a new kind of love. The first few months were exhilarating and terrifying. We'd have these incredible moments, long talks, quiet mornings, laughter that felt even more special than before. But there were also moments of doubt, times when I'd lie awake at night, scared that if things went wrong, I'd lose my best friend forever. Every time we fought, every time we had a misunderstanding, I'd panic, afraid that we'd somehow undo everything we'd built. Then, one night, after a particularly stupid argument, I broke down. "What if we're making a mistake?" I whispered, barely able to look at him. He took my hand, his grip steady and reassuring. "We're not," he said simply. "If there's anyone I'd risk everything with, it's you." That was all I needed to hear. We both knew this wasn't perfect, that we'd make mistakes, that we'd have hard times. But we also knew that we'd fought too hard, waited too long to let fear stand in our way. It's been almost a year now, and he's still my best friend, but he's also the person I want beside me through every part of my life. We still have our movie nights, our inside jokes, the little traditions that make us us. But now, there's something deeper, a closeness that makes me feel like I've finally found home. Every so often, I'll catch him looking at me with that same soft smile he had that first night, and I'm overwhelmed with gratitude. For years, I thought love was supposed to be this big, complicated thing. But with him, it's just easy, just real. It's the kind of love that grows quietly, the kind that you don't even realize is there until one day. It's everything. And now, every time someone asks if I saw this coming, I just laugh because honestly, I didn't. But looking back, I can't believe I didn't see it all along. Because sometimes, the person you've been looking for has been right beside you all along, just waiting for the moment when you're both ready to see. Here's one more about my friend Carly, who had a short-lived gig as a driver for a high-end personal delivery service. Her job was to deliver luxury items to wealthy clients. Things like designer handbags, rare wines, even the occasional piece of jewelry. Most days, she was driving around in a pristine company car, dropping off packages at gated mansions and high-rise condos. But then she got the call, the one she says will forever be burned into her memory. It was a late Friday evening, and Carly had just finished her last delivery when her manager texted her, "One more stop. VIP client. Full discretion required." She sighed, but figured it'd be worth the overtime pay. The address was for a penthouse downtown, and the package, when she picked it up, was huge. A massive, gilded birdcage with a velvet cover over it. She could feel something shifting inside, but the instructions were clear. Do not uncover the cage. When she arrived at the penthouse, a young woman with a tight-lipped smile opened the door, looking like she was barely holding it together. She motioned Carly in quickly and locked the door behind them, peeking nervously down the hallway. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, like they were conspiring in some spy movie. She didn't even make eye contact, just gestured toward a corner of the room where Carly was to leave the cage. As Carly set the cage down, she heard a series of strange, guttural chirps from under the velvet cover. Whatever was inside sounded big and agitated. She couldn't help herself. She asked, "So, what exactly am I delivering here?" The woman sighed, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. "It's a rare bird. Extremely rare. He has a reputation." Carly thought she was kidding, but the woman's serious expression said otherwise. She explained, in hushed tones, that the bird belonged to her boss, a very powerful and particular man who collected exotic pets. The bird was notorious for causing incidents, which was why it was being moved in secret. Carly's mind was racing, trying to picture what kind of bird needed this much secrecy. Before she could ask any more questions, the woman handed her an envelope with cash and a tip that was worth more than her last week's salary. Carly nodded, thanked her, and turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, she heard it. The bird squawked out in a deep, gravelly voice, "You're all doomed." Carly froze, turning slowly to the woman, who looked embarrassed, but shrugged as if this was normal. "Yeah," she muttered. "He talks." The bird squawked again, louder this time. "Run while you can." Carly's jaw dropped. She'd heard about parrots that could mimic voices, but this bird sounded almost intentional. As she stood there, stunned, the bird continued, "It's not over. It's never over." She couldn't tell if the bird was just repeating things it had overheard, or if it somehow understood what was happening. Either way, the whole situation was way above her pay grade. Without a word, Carly nodded to the woman, backed out of the penthouse, and practically sprinted to the elevator. As the doors closed, she heard one last echoing cry from the bird, shouting, "The end is near." Carly never took another delivery for that client. In fact, she quit a week later, convinced that no amount of overtime could justify end-of-the-world birds in luxury cages. Now, whenever someone asks her why she left such a fancy job, she just laughs and says, "Let's just say, I've been warned." I met Jake at a farmer's market, of all places. He was at the honey stand, sampling different jars with the intensity of a food critic. We struck up a conversation about the merits of wildflower versus clover honey, and he ended up buying a jar for me as a souvenir of our impromptu debate. He was charming in a quirky, unexpected way and asked if I wanted to go out for dinner sometime. I agreed, thinking it was rare to find someone with that mix of spontaneity and down-to-earth appeal. A few days later, we met up at a dimly lit, trendy bistro he'd picked out. He was already there when I arrived, waving enthusiastically from the table. We exchanged smiles, and after a little small talk, I felt my guard start to relax. The waiter came by, and Jake ordered for both of us, saying he'd put together a tasting adventure since he knew the menu well. I thought it was a bit presumptive, but also kind of endearing. The appetizers arrived, and as we started eating, he launched into a story about his most recent camping trip, which seemed harmless enough. "Yes, so there I was," he began, his eyes lighting up. "Just me and nature, alone under the stars with no tent." I raised an eyebrow, interested but slightly confused. "No tent?" I asked. He nodded, smiling like a man who'd just unlocked the secrets of the universe. "I don't believe in using them," he said earnestly. "They block the energy from the earth." I chuckled, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. He went on to explain how tents are an unnatural barrier between humans and grounding energy, which he believed was essential for good health. "I like to really connect with the earth," he said, as if he were discussing something as basic as brushing his teeth. "Sleeping bags, mats, that stuff isn't natural. Bare ground or nothing." He then pulled up his sleeve to reveal what looked like a homemade tattoo of a tree, which he proudly explained he'd done himself to symbolize my connection with nature. He added that he didn't believe in tattoo parlors because art should come from within. I nodded, doing my best to keep an open mind, though I was increasingly concerned about what else should come from within. He spent the next 10 minutes detailing his philosophy of earthing, which, as he explained, meant spending as much time barefoot as possible, no matter where he was. He proudly admitted to going barefoot around town, claiming that it was healthier and more authentic. He even pulled up a few pictures on his phone of his footprint collection, imprints he'd made in various types of soil and mud from his travels, each labeled by location like some kind of naturalist diary. By the time the entrees arrived, I was genuinely intrigued in that train wreck can't look away kind of way. Just as I thought we might veer into a more normal topic, he leaned forward, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I braced myself, nodding. "Do you use soap?" I blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, of course," I replied, wondering if this was a trick question. He sighed, visibly disappointed. "That's a shame," he said, shaking his head. "Soap disrupts your body's natural oils. I haven't used soap in 3 years." I swallowed hard, trying to maintain my composure, but he continued, launching into a speech about how commercial hygiene products were a scam and that true cleanliness comes from natural oils and reconnecting with natural elements. He even claimed that his skin was healthier because he occasionally exfoliated by rubbing dirt on it. "It's like nature's microdermabrasion," he explained, looking genuinely convinced of his method. To my horror, he then invited me to smell his hand to prove how fresh he was, extending it across the table with a challenging look. I hesitated, torn between politeness and self-preservation. Not wanting to be rude, I leaned in slightly, but thankfully, he pulled back, laughing. "I'm just messing with you," he said, though he looked a bit disappointed when I didn't take him up on the offer. I tried changing the subject, asking him if he had any pets, hoping that might lead to safer ground. But instead, his face lit up. "I do, actually," he said, reaching for his phone again. "I have a tarantula named Goose, a ball python named Slinky, and a pair of Madagascar hissing cockroaches, Ted and Alice." He proceeded to show me pictures, zooming in on the cockroaches with a look of utter pride. "Aren't they beautiful?" he asked, practically glowing. I managed a weak smile, nodding in what I hoped was a convincing show of interest. But he wasn't done. "The cockroaches are actually very affectionate," he explained. "They recognize me. Sometimes they'll crawl onto my hand when I feed them. It's very grounding." At this point, I was desperately eyeing the exit, wondering how I could politely end the night. But Jake, blissfully unaware of my internal panic, leaned in close, his voice soft and serious. "Look, I know this might be a lot for some people, but you seem different. I feel like we're on the same wavelength." I gave a non-committal smile, hoping he'd wrap things up, but instead, he reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "Would you be interested in joining me on a silent meditation retreat next weekend? Just me, you, and the sounds of nature. No talking, no phones. Just pure energy." I bit my lip, suppressing a laugh. "Wow, that's really something," I said, struggling to find words that didn't sound rude. "But I think that's maybe a bit fast." He nodded solemnly, looking disappointed but understanding. "I get it," he said. "It's a lot to ask, but if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." Finally, the check arrived, and I was ready to bolt. He insisted on paying, saying he didn't believe in monetary exchanges between soul connections. I thanked him, genuinely relieved, and practically sprinted to my car, breathing a sigh of relief as soon as I was safely inside. The next day, he texted me a long message about how he'd felt our energies connect and hoped we could reunite under a full moon sometime. He also included a link to a natural soap alternative blog in case I was ready to transition away from toxins. I never replied. For weeks afterward, I'd get the occasional message from him. Pictures of mud trails, close-ups of his pet cockroaches, and even a selfie with his snake draped around his neck, captioned me and Slinky, vibing in nature. Eventually, the messages stopped, though sometimes I'd see him at the farmer's market, scanning jars of honey, barefoot and blissful. Jake became a legendary story among my friends, and to this day, whenever one of them meets someone new, we jokingly ask if he uses soap or owns grounding cockroaches. And while I'll always be grateful for the story he gave me, I'm also pretty sure I'll be steering clear of the honey stand from now on. It started with a postcard. I'd been living in the same apartment for years, the kind of place you don't quite love, but you can't quite leave. It was a little shabby, always a bit drafty in the winter, with squeaky floors and a kitchen that was just slightly too small. I liked my life well enough, steady job, decent friends, the usual routines, but lately I'd felt like I was drifting, like I was coasting through days that all started to look the same. One Thursday, I came home from work, and there, sticking out from the stack of junk mail, was a small, weathered postcard. It was old, the corners bent and faded, with a picture of a lighthouse on the front. The card was postmarked from somewhere in Maine, but there was no name or return address. Just a short, handwritten message in beautiful cursive. Come see for yourself. M. It felt like something from a novel. Who sends postcards anymore? And who was M? I racked my brain, but I couldn't think of anyone I knew with that initial. But something about it tugged at me. A random invitation to an unknown place, sent by a stranger? It was intriguing, even a little thrilling. I set it aside, figuring it was just some odd coincidence, maybe a mistake. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I found myself staring at that postcard, imagining what it would be like to leave everything behind and just go. It felt ridiculous, irresponsible even, but at the same time, I could feel that familiar restlessness stirring, a yearning I'd ignored for years. Finally, on a whim, I decided to go. I packed a bag, took a few days off work, and booked a ticket up to Maine. I didn't have much of a plan, just a map with the name of the coastal town I guess the postcard had come from. When I told my friends about it, they thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. Something inside me was pulling me there, and I knew I had to follow it. When I arrived, I felt like I'd stepped into another world. The town was small, quiet, tucked away along a rocky coastline that stretched endlessly under a wide, open sky. It had a kind of timelessness to it, like it existed just a little outside of everything else. The air was salty and sharp, and seagulls called overhead as I made my way through the narrow streets. I checked into a tiny bed and breakfast run by an older woman named Sarah. She had a warm, easy smile and seemed unsurprised by my lack of a plan. When I mentioned the postcard, she tilted her head, intrigued. "That's strange," she said. "People don't usually come here without a reason." "Well, maybe this is my reason," I said with a shrug, though I didn't fully believe it myself. But she just nodded, like she understood, and handed me the key to my room. The next morning, I took a walk down by the shore, following the winding path along the cliffs. Eventually, I came to a small hill overlooking the ocean, where an old, weathered lighthouse stood, just like the one on the postcard. It was silent, isolated, standing vigil over the vast expanse of sea and sky. I climbed up to the top of the hill and sat there, letting the breeze tug at my hair, listening to the waves crash below. As I sat there, I noticed something strange, a small wooden bench near the edge of the cliff, with a plaque on it. I walked over and squinted at the inscription. "For those in search of themselves." It was such a simple phrase, yet it struck me in a way I hadn't expected. For a long time, I'd felt like I'd lost touch with myself, buried beneath responsibilities and routines. I'd built a life that was safe, predictable, but also incomplete. And here I was sitting on a cliff by a lighthouse in Maine, feeling more alive than I had in years. I spent the rest of the day exploring, wandering through the little shops, talking to locals who all seemed to know each other, savoring the freedom of being somewhere entirely new. That night, Sarah invited me down to the common area, where a few other guests were sitting around a fireplace, swapping stories. I joined them, sharing bits and pieces of my own life, feeling strangely unburdened as I talked about things I hadn't thought about in ages. Dreams I'd once had, places I'd wanted to go, things I'd put off for later. One of the other guests, an older man with a gentle voice, leaned over and asked me, "Do you ever feel like there's a part of you waiting to be lived?" His question caught me off guard. I sat there, staring into the fire, realizing that he'd put into words something I hadn't been able to articulate. Yes, I did feel that way. And somehow, sitting there, surrounded by strangers who felt like friends, I realized that this trip was about more than just the postcard. It was a reminder, a nudge to remember the parts of myself I'd been neglecting, the dreams I'd shelved. The next morning, I returned to the lighthouse, this time with my journal. I sat on that bench, overlooking the ocean, and started writing, pouring out everything I'd kept bottled up, the dreams, the fears, the feeling that life was passing me by. I wrote about the things I wanted, things I'd been too afraid to admit to myself. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the water. I felt lighter, like I'd shed a layer of doubt and fear that I'd been carrying for years. I knew I couldn't stay in Maine forever, but I also knew I couldn't go back to the life I'd left exactly as it was. When I returned home, I kept that postcard on my nightstand, a small reminder of the weekend that had shifted something inside me. I didn't make any drastic changes right away, but I started carving out time for things that mattered to me. I joined a local art class, started going on weekend hikes, and even reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen in ages. Bit by bit, I was piecing together a life that felt fuller, more intentional. And every now and then, I would take out my journal, rereading the words I'd written on that cliff, remembering the promise I'd made to myself. To live fully, to be present, to seek out the parts of myself I'd left behind. I never found out who sent that postcard. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe it was meant for someone else. But somehow, I think it found exactly who it was meant to reach. That single postcard, a tiny, seemingly insignificant piece of paper, had led me on a journey I didn't even know I needed. And now, every time I feel myself slipping back into old patterns, I look at that postcard and remember that life doesn't have to be planned out perfectly. Sometimes it's the unexpected invitations, the small, random nudges that lead us exactly where we're meant to be. I met Connor at a wine tasting class. He was charming and had this quirky sense of humor, making ridiculous comparisons between wines. This one tastes like a pine tree on vacation, that had the whole group laughing. We hit it off immediately, and by the end of the evening, he asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime. His personality seemed playful and fun, and I figured, why not? On the night of our date, he picked me up in a beat-up old VW van that looked like it had been around since the 70s. He hopped out with this big, goofy smile, wearing a vintage leather jacket and a scarf that looked like it might have been hand-knitted. He opened the door for me and said, "Sorry if it smells like, well, old van. I think it adds character, don't you?" I laughed and climbed in, deciding that maybe the van was part of his quirky charm. We arrived at a tiny, hole-in-the-wall taco joint. It was the kind of place where you order at a counter, and there are 3 items on the menu, all involving various combinations of carnitas and guacamole. We found a spot outside, and he immediately launched into a story about a road trip he'd taken in the van, traveling across the country and living off the grid. He made it sound adventurous, describing how he'd camped out in deserts, cooked his meals over a campfire, and befriended a stray cat he met somewhere in Arizona. The way he talked, it was like he'd starred in his own indie film, complete with a grungy soundtrack. It was going great, honestly. I was genuinely enjoying myself, thinking he was this free-spirited guy who'd lived a lot of life. But then, as we were halfway through our tacos, he leaned forward and said, "So, I have to tell you about the most incredible discovery I made on my trip." He paused dramatically. I found my spirit animal. I managed to hold back a chuckle, not sure if he was serious. But he was, his eyes wide with excitement. I was in this really remote part of New Mexico, meditating under the stars, and suddenly I felt this presence. When I opened my eyes, there was a coyote just staring at me from across the desert. And I just knew, like, deep down, I knew this coyote was my spirit guide. He went on to describe how he believed the coyote had spoken to him in a mystical, nonverbal way. It was like he was telling me to embrace the wild, untamed parts of myself. "Wow, that's amazing," I replied, doing my best to sound supportive. He nodded, clearly thrilled by my reaction. "I mean, most people wouldn't understand," he said, looking around as if we were in on a secret together. "The coyote taught me to listen to my instincts, to live by my own rules. It's why I don't really believe in, conventional hygiene, My eyebrows shot up, but before I could ask, he leaned in, whispering like he was about to share a sacred truth. I haven't used deodorant in 3 years. He said it like he was confessing a deep, life-altering revelation. It's all part of breaking free from societal expectations, he continued, looking at me with a mix of pride and defiance. I want to live authentically, without artificial chemicals. I tried not to react, thinking maybe he'd move on to another topic. But he only grew more animated, launching into a detailed explanation of his natural lifestyle. He described how he bathed only in freshwater sources when he could find them, which he claimed had a spiritual cleansing effect that tap water couldn't provide. Tap water has all these added chemicals, he said, grimacing. It's not natural. Lakes, rivers, that's real water. I must have looked like I was still trying to process everything because he smiled, patting my hand reassuringly. Don't worry, he said. I know it's a lot, but once you break free of those chains, you can never go back. He went on to explain that he believed in earth healing, which apparently involved covering himself in dirt to reconnect with the soil. He even kept a small jar of dirt from the Grand Canyon in his van, which he proudly showed me later, saying it was energized by the spirits of the land. As the night went on, he revealed more of his off-the-grid practices. He told me he didn't own a phone because he believed electronics interfered with the body's natural vibrations. Instead, he used a collection of payphones around town to stay in touch with people, which he described with a surprising amount of pride, as though he were some kind of modern-day nomad. At some point, I figured I might as well ask about his living situation, thinking maybe he'd rented a cabin somewhere. But no, he leaned back, crossing his arms with a satisfied smile, and said, I live in the van. Full-time. Rent is just another chain society tries to lock you in. He then launched into a monologue about how he believed humans were meant to live nomadically, and how he was on a journey to find his true place in the world. I tried to ask if he had any kind of long-term plan, but he just shook his head, looking slightly disappointed. I don't believe in plans, he said. I follow the wind, like the coyote. He then went on to explain that he was considering getting a tattoo of a coyote paw print on his chest to honor his spirit guide. Finally, the check arrived, and I was trying to figure out how to gracefully end the night. But as we got up, he held up a hand. Wait, there's one more thing, he said, rummaging around in his van. He emerged with a small, leather-bound journal, covered in drawings of various animals, mountains, and what looked like mystical symbols. This is my dream journal, he said, looking at me with an intense expression. I record all my visions and messages from the universe in here. He opened it to a recent entry, his finger tracing over some hastily scribbled notes. Last night, I dreamed I was in a forest surrounded by wolves. They were howling, calling me to join them. I think it was a sign that I'm ready for the next phase of my journey. He closed the journal and looked at me, his eyes shining. I think you could be part of that journey. I managed a polite smile, my brain scrambling for an exit strategy. Wow, that's deep, I said, trying to sound appreciative. He nodded, gazing at me with something almost like reverence. You have a good energy. I could feel it the moment we met. It's rare to find someone who just gets it, As he walked me back to my car, he offered me his leather bracelet. Take this, he said, pressing it into my hand. It's made from reclaimed materials I found on my travels. It'll remind you of our connection to the earth. I thanked him, not quite sure what else to say, and tucked it into my bag. The next day, he sent me a handwritten letter. Yes, an actual letter. It was several pages long, filled with poetic musings about the winds of destiny and his hopes that our souls would meet again under a full moon. He also included a small vial of sacred dirt from his Grand Canyon jar, in case I needed to ground myself. I never responded, but for weeks afterward, I kept the letter tucked in a drawer, pulling it out occasionally to remind myself that dating is indeed a wild adventure. And whenever someone mentions camping or living off the grid, I think of Connor, the man who followed the coyote and offered me sacred dirt, and wonder what uncharted roads he's exploring now. If someone had told me a few years ago that I'd be the owner of a thriving puzzle library, I would have assumed they were talking about some movie character. Not me. Back then, I was just another overworked consultant, drowning in deadlines, caffeine, and late nights at the office. Puzzles? They were something my grandma kept in her living room, pieces missing, half-finished, gathering dust. But as with most unlikely journeys, mine began with a single, fateful puzzle. It was a rainy Sunday, one of those weekends where my to-do list felt endless, but my motivation was at rock bottom. To escape, I went on a walk around my neighborhood and found myself ducking into a little bookstore I'd never noticed before. In the back corner, I spotted a 1,000-piece puzzle with a beautiful, intricate scene of a bustling European street at dusk. The cobblestones, the tiny lamplights, the people carrying umbrellas, it was so detailed I couldn't resist. I bought it on a whim, telling myself it'd be a fun way to unplug for a bit. That puzzle consumed my entire afternoon. I started with the edges, worked my way through the murky gray sky, then slowly pieced together the cobbled street and little umbrellas. It was frustrating, yes, but there was something addicting about fitting each piece into place, watching the image come to life. Hours flew by without me even noticing, and by the time I snapped in the last piece, I felt this calm satisfaction I hadn't experienced in ages. The next day, I went to work feeling oddly refreshed, and when I mentioned it to my coworkers, several of them perked up. "Oh, I used to love puzzles," one of them said, "but I don't have the patience anymore." Another added, "They're so fun, but I don't want to buy a ton just to finish them and stash them away." I started thinking about how satisfying it was to do that puzzle, but how strange it would feel to buy one after another, only to have them gather dust in a closet. It felt wasteful, and more than that, it felt lonely. Puzzles, I realized, seemed like something that could bring people together. After all, why not share the joy? That night, I had an idea. I went online and found a few high-quality puzzles, each with interesting, colorful scenes, and ordered them. I reached out to a few friends, asking if they'd be interested in swapping puzzles once we finished each one. They loved the idea, and within a couple of weeks, we had our own little puzzle circle going. We'd meet up every few weeks to trade puzzles, chat about which parts had stumped us, and of course, complain about that one piece that always seemed to go missing. It became a small but delightful ritual. Before long, word spread, and I started getting messages from people asking if they could join in or borrow a puzzle. I was thrilled, but quickly realized I didn't have enough to share with everyone. So I went on a hunt for secondhand puzzles, picking them up from thrift stores, estate sales, and online marketplaces. My tiny collection grew into a small mountain, and my apartment became something of an unofficial puzzle lending library. Friends of friends, and even neighbors would stop by to pick up a puzzle, then return it in exchange for another. One evening, a woman I barely knew dropped by to swap out her puzzle. As she was leaving, she turned and said, "You know, I really think you can make a business out of this. I'd pay a monthly fee to have access to these puzzles." I laughed it off at first, but after she left, I couldn't stop thinking about it. A puzzle subscription service? It sounded almost silly, but the more I considered it, the more it made sense. People wanted the experience of solving a puzzle without having to buy and store it. They just needed someone to manage the collection and coordinate the swaps. And I already had the perfect starting point. The next day, I sat down and made a plan. I came up with a name, piece by piece, and decided to offer a monthly subscription service. For a small fee, members would get one puzzle at a time, with the option to swap it out as soon as they were done. I set up a basic website, uploaded photos of the puzzles I had, and sent out an invitation to my little puzzle circle, letting them know that Piece by Piece was officially open for business. I expected maybe a handful of people to join, but within a week, I had over 50 signups. Friends referred friends, coworkers referred coworkers, and soon people I'd never even met were reaching out. They loved the idea of borrowing puzzles, and some even sent me their old puzzles to add to the collection. It felt like a community was forming, one piece at a time. With the growing interest, I knew I needed more space. So I rented a small, cozy storefront in the neighborhood, painted it in warm, inviting colors, and lined the walls with shelves for puzzles. Piece by Piece officially became a real, physical puzzle library. People could come in, browse the puzzles, and chat with other puzzle lovers. We set up a couple of tables for people who wanted to work on puzzles together or just get out of the house for a bit. To my surprise, the library became a neighborhood hub. People would drop by after work, pick up a new puzzle, or just sit down and chat. I started hosting puzzle nights every Friday, where people could bring their snacks and drinks, sit around big communal tables, and work on giant puzzles together. We'd laugh, swap stories, and help each other find those stubborn missing pieces. It felt like a return to a slower, simpler way of connecting with people, something I'd been craving without even realizing it. Then one day, I got an email from a local elementary school. They were interested in partnering with Piece by Piece to provide puzzles for their students, puzzles they could take home and work on with their families. They loved the idea of encouraging kids to unplug, slow down, and focus on something together. We arranged a small lending program, and every month, I'd send a batch of puzzles to the school for students to borrow and return. Soon, other schools joined in, and I expanded the program to include puzzles with educational themes, world maps, famous landmarks, animals of the rainforest. Piece by Piece continued to grow, and with it so did my dream. We started offering custom puzzle designs, created from photos or artwork customers sent us. People loved the idea of piecing together a photo from their last vacation or a painting by a favorite artist. We even hosted puzzle-making workshops where people could create their own designs and then take home the finished puzzle. I hired a small team, mostly puzzle enthusiasts who loved chatting with customers and coming up with new ideas to make Piece by Piece feel special. Today, Piece by Piece is thriving. We have hundreds of members, a bustling storefront, and a strong community of people who've become friends over shared puzzles. We host everything from puzzle competitions to silent puzzle nights, where people can work in quiet, calm spaces with soft music in the background. People thank me regularly for creating this little haven of calm, and it's surreal to think that it all started with a single, rainy afternoon puzzle. Looking back, I can hardly believe the path my life has taken. I went from drowning in work stress to running a business that brings people joy, all thanks to a hobby I never expected to take seriously. Piece by Piece taught me that sometimes the most fulfilling careers don't come from ambitious plans or 5-year goals. They come from following what makes you happy, even if it starts with something as simple as a puzzle. And now, every time I see someone's face light up when they find that last piece, I know I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. I met Liam at a bookshop, where we bonded over a shared love of historical fiction. He was leaning against a shelf, deep in thought, when I walked by, and he struck up a conversation about which books were underrated and deserved more attention. He had this quiet confidence and intellectual vibe that drew me in immediately. When he asked if I'd like to grab coffee sometime, I agreed, thinking finally a guy who loves books and seems normal. We met a few days later at a little cafe that was half covered in ivy, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a storybook. He was already waiting with a coffee in hand, dressed in a chunky sweater and round glasses, looking like he'd walked out of a novel himself. We ordered drinks, sat down, and started chatting. Everything about him seemed thoughtful and grounded. He talked about his favorite writers, his passion for vintage bookshops, and his goal of writing a novel someday. By the time our drinks arrived, I was charmed, convinced he was everything I'd been looking for. It was all going well, until I mentioned that I'd been binge-watching a true crime documentary series. His face lit up, but not in the way I expected. "You know," he said, leaning in with a serious expression, "I'm really into crime, but like solving it." I tilted my head, intrigued, and asked if he meant true crime stories or detective novels. But he shook his head. "No, like real crime. I've been investigating a case for months now." Before I could ask what he meant, he pulled out a small notebook and began flipping through pages of scribbled notes, drawings, and what looked like maps. "There's this unsolved mystery in town," he whispered, as though we were in on a huge secret together. "It's haunted me for years." He went on to explain that he believed there was a hidden criminal underbelly in our otherwise sleepy town, and he was determined to expose it. I tried to keep a straight face, nodding along as he launched into a monologue about a suspicious neighbor who disappeared for 3 months and then returned acting different. He was convinced the man was a double agent working for some shadowy organization. "I've been tracking his movements," Liam said, pulling out a hand-drawn map marked with red circles and arrows. "He always takes the same route to the grocery store, but I think he's making drops along the way. There are signs." I couldn't help but ask what kinds of signs. He leaned in, looking around to make sure no one else was listening, and whispered, "Footprints and cigarette butts that weren't there before. It's like he's leaving clues, hoping someone will pick up on them." By now, I was doing my best to keep from laughing, but I was also kind of fascinated by how serious he was. "So, what are you going to do?" I asked, not entirely sure I wanted to know. He looked at me with the intensity of a noir detective. "I need someone on the inside," he said gravely. "Someone who can help me without drawing too much attention." I stared at him, realizing with growing horror that he meant me. "You seem perceptive," he said, looking at me as if he'd just uncovered a valuable ally. "I think you'd make a great partner." He paused and asked, "Are you in?" I hesitated, trying to find a polite way out of this. "I don't know. I've never done anything like that," I mumbled, hoping he'd back off. But he just smiled, his eyes gleaming. "Perfect. You're exactly the kind of person they'd never suspect. We could start with small tasks. Stakeouts, maybe even a little reconnaissance." He leaned back, satisfied, as if he'd just secured a new recruit. Trying to lighten the mood, I laughed and said, "Well, as long as there's no breaking and entering involved." But he didn't laugh. Instead, he got this faraway look in his eyes and said, "Sometimes you have to bend the rules to find the truth." At that point, I began plotting my exit strategy. But before I could make an excuse, he pulled out his phone, showing me a series of grainy photos of random buildings and alleyways. Each one zoomed in on things like cracks in the walls or faint tire marks on the ground. "Evidence," he said in a hushed tone, nodding solemnly. "They're all connected. I just haven't figured out how yet." By now, I was thoroughly alarmed but also mildly entertained. I nodded along, hoping to humor him, but then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small recorder. "I've recorded their conversations," he whispered. "It's mostly muffled, but sometimes you can hear words. Code words." "What kind of words?" I asked, trying to keep the curiosity in my voice from sounding like concern. He hesitated, clearly excited to share his findings. "Last week, I heard someone say the shipment's in. And a few days before that, someone mentioned the boss." He looked at me, his eyes wide. "This is bigger than we think." I took a deep breath, mustering every ounce of restraint to avoid laughing. "You really think there's an organization?" I asked. He nodded, completely serious. "I don't just think. I know. And you could be a part of it. Imagine the two of us unmasking the truth." He paused dramatically, like he was in the final scene of a detective movie. "Are you ready to be my partner in justice?" I stammered, trying to find a gentle way to let him down. "I mean, I really appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm not sure I'd be very good at undercover work." He looked a bit deflated, but quickly recovered, his face alight with another idea. "Maybe I can train you," he said eagerly. "We could start with basic detective skills. You'd be surprised at how much you can pick up just by observing people." At that point, I realized I had to end the night before he roped me into his next mission. I glanced at my watch and feigned surprise. "Oh wow, it's getting late. I actually have an early morning tomorrow," I said, standing up with what I hoped was a polite smile. He looked disappointed but nodded, saying, "Of course. A true detective knows when to rest." He walked me to my car, and just before I got in, he handed me a small notebook. "For your notes," he said seriously, "just in case you change your mind." I thanked him, taking the notebook with a forced smile, and quickly closed the car door. As I drove home, I half expected him to follow me, wondering if he'd stake out my house too. But thankfully he didn't. The next day, he texted me a series of updates on the case, which I ignored. A few days later, he sent a final message. "I understand if the responsibility was too much. Some people just aren't cut out for this life. Best of luck." For weeks, my friends couldn't get enough of the Detective Liam saga, reenacting his serious expressions and dramatically whispering the shipments in. And as for me, I learned a valuable lesson. If you meet a guy who seems too much like a character from a mystery novel, he probably is.